Well, hello, degenerate heathens. I'm sorry for making y'all wait on new videos for so long. I took a break for my SO's birthday, and, well, I had to say goodbye to my bearded dragon Alphonse this past weekend. He's been in a few videos I've made, and he helped inspire the reptile theme here, partially, and he will be dearly missed. And thank you all for your kind words in his passing. I made a post about it. But today, we're going to be looking at two types of fundamentalists, as well as the relevant biology. In one corner, we have Matt Walsh, the Christian fundamentalist. In the other corner, we have the woke gender fundamentalists, activists Addison and Vincent, and their clash on the Dr. Phil show. I will say off the bat that I am not against trans people, and categorically that biologically changing your gender and sex are indeed scientifically possible. It happens in nature, and it will only continue to improve in humans with our technology. Womb transplants, artificial organs are just around the corner. So is massive gene editing, designer genetics. So I'm not arguing against trans people. In fact, quite the opposite. What I'm arguing against here will be the fundamentalist attitude some of these activists have that ironically erases trans people, lesbians also in particular, and gender nonconforming cis people. So trans people are on the binary. They transition from one gender to the other. Non-binary basically spits in the face of that, says that if you're a manly girl or a girly man, that's a new gender. And asking someone's pronouns is more likely to actually just let them know that you clocked them as not cis. So this is really deeply problematic. I don't, in principle, believe in trigger warnings, but warning, I'm going to be using some real blunt, basic layman's terms. I'm not going to be tiptoeing around things. I'm going to say offensive things. If you don't want to hear that, you don't have to watch. But there we go. I could keep giving a lengthy intro, but let's just jump in, and you'll see what I mean.
Dr. Phil, the dispute over gender pronouns.
I don't identify exclusively with being a man or a woman. I use they and them as my pronouns.
You don't get your own pronouns.
You think it's a delusion.
In school, our kids are being asked what their pronoun is.
This is a war on gender.
The dispute over gender pronouns.
I don't identify exclusively with being a man or a woman. I use they and them as my pronouns.
You don't get your own pronouns.
You think it's a delusion.
I use
Over today on an all-new Dr. Phil. The dispute over gender pronouns.
I don't identify exclusively with being a man or a woman. I use they and them as my pronouns.
You don't get your own pronouns.
You think it's a delusion.
In school, our kids are being asked what their pronoun is.
This is a war on gender.
Babies are babies without a known sex.
When they were born, we did not assign a sex.
You think it's toxic to raise your hand if you the other. Well, I have a question. Raise your hand if you have heard of gender pronouns such as he, she, or they, and Z or V. Raise your hand if you're confused about how to use them in today's social climate. Yeah. I'm asking these questions because approximately 1.2 million people in the U.S. identify as non-binary, meaning they don't identify as she or he, but they and other pronouns. Now, as society's attitudes about gender are continuously evolving, the practice of specifying one's pronouns is relatively new. Now, I just want to say, I don't have all the answers, not even close. But I'm totally open to learning, and I want this to be a safe place to talk about and learn. But not every person is on board with this new movement. Half of Americans say they feel very or somewhat comfortable using gender-neutral pronouns, while 48% say they feel very or somewhat uncomfortable using them. Now, this growing debate regarding the use of pronouns has this country pretty divided. Take a look.
Controversy tonight over a new policy on how gender identity is addressed.
You may notice
will non-binary assign
nouns.
Individual.
And I'm Ethan. Addison and Ethan have a lot to say.
I'm Addison.
And I'm Ethan. We and Ethan have a lot to say. Gender pronouns are a big topic of conversation that cannot and should not be ignored. And my first guests, Addison and Ethan, have a lot to
Oh, I'm sorry. I guess it's Ethan. I said Vincent, right?
say.
I'm Addison.
And I'm Ethan.
We've been together for about
5 years.
And married
for 3 years.
I use they, them pronouns. Being non-binary just means that I just don't identify with the gender I was assigned at birth, and I don't identify exclusively with being a man or a woman. I'm something in between.
So, right off the bat, you are not assigned a gender at birth, other than nature. You were born with a particular set of genitalia, and the doctor noted this on your birth certificate. Period. End of story. We don't even do genetic testing on babies. They're identified by a third person, not assigned. So that's really the end of the story, and they're identified by their sex characteristics, their phenotype, not their genotype. Yes, it can get a little more complicated, but we'll get to that. And I never really know what it means to identify as both male and female. Everyone can identify with people from all walks of life, and there's going to be a bit of, I'm going to try and avoid equivocation of the term identify, because you can identify something as a third person, you can identify something as a thing, or you can identify with a third person things, as in you empathize or sympathize with them, or see yourself in them. But I don't know what it means to identify as both male and female. I actually don't. I understand what it is to identify with the masculine and the feminine, so we'll explore that. Again, anyone can identify with people from all walks of life. I can identify with people who are not in my racial group. Does that mean I am part of a different racial group? No, it just means I'm not a racist and I see people as people. Let's not delve into race arguments today either. So identification in the sense of this, what we're talking about here is not, I'm going to try and make a differentiation between when other people are talking about you, identifying traits in you, and identifying with you, identifying with other things, other people, animals, etc. But let's talk about what it means to identify as gender non-conforming. What the non-binaries are actually saying is, or insinuating, is that because they aren't a stereotypical whatever gender they are, that means they actually have a different gender, a new gender, a third gender, or third plus gender. So this actually really is wrong, because there's nothing wrong with being a feminine man or a masculine woman. And that should not create a new gender category. Okay? And the idea that this should is toxic. It's actually sad. It's sadly destroying a lot of lesbian people, because now butch lesbians think that they can't be a woman if they're masculine. It must mean they're a man or not either one or both. And I have no problem with trans men, but there is a huge disparity between trans men and trans women. All of a sudden, trans men are like hundreds, thousands of percentage points more prevalent than trans women, and in a specific young female demographic population. So there seems to be some kind of social contagion surrounding the narrative of gender going on. And ironically, the gender activists are upholding the strictest possible gender roles and expressions like Matt Walsh would want us to have, because if they feel like they're not a stereotypically masculine man, they must not be a man, etc. And this is really toxic. The thought process is, you're a guy with a beard, but you want to have long hair and wear makeup. Therefore, you're not a man. You're a new category. This is, it actually confuses people a lot more instead of communicates ideas properly, instead of just allowing men to have a space where they feel comfortable being pretty and feminine. You have to instead create this new category of gender. And to be fair, this is why they'll say, you get to decide for yourself what your gender expression means to you. But they don't really mean this, because that would mean that, okay, we can have feminine men and they're still men. And this just ends up meaning that there's no meaning to any of the words being used. We'll get to that. So I digress. Back to the show.
Between outside of that binary.
My pronouns are he or they. 5 years.
I'm married
for 3 years.
I use they, them pronouns. Being non-binary just means that I just don't identify with the gender I was assigned at birth, and I don't identify exclusively with being a man or a woman. I'm something in between, outside of that binary.
Okay, you're still on the binary of masculine and feminine, even if we're believing that everything has been said is making sense so far. There aren't gendered traits outside of that. There just aren't. I'm going to categorically throw out all genders beyond non-binary just at the start. They don't exist. Okay? Categorically. There's kind of an argument for an androgynous gender, but not really. Or at least it doesn't make sense to me. So, and if you just have long hair and makeup and a dress, being born male, if that makes you non-binary, you are clearly following the gender binary social construct of masculinity and femininity, and saying because you don't fit the stereotype, you must be another gender. This is absolutely an assault on the concept of gender non-conforming cis people.
My pronouns are he or they. I also identify as a non-binary. To me,
so he identifies as both man and, which is man, a binary gender, and non-binary. How? Both binary and not binary. Cool. So we're already making a mockery of LGBT and language and logic and categorization just in one tiny sentence. This is why we call them special snowflakes. They want to have their cake and eat it too. Literally, this person identifies himself as both man and not man. It doesn't get more incoherent than that. And it's all about feelings. It's all about emotions. And I'm not hating on this person. All love to them. It's just, I'm removing, I'm not trying to remove compassion, but I'm trying to remove feeling and emotion from arguments, okay? I'm trying to keep them separate.
Being non-binary means having the sense of freedom to explore my gender in whichever way I want. I don't.
You can already do that. You can explore your biological sex or your transgender in the exact same way that you're doing right now. I mean, I have, again, nothing wrong, either biologically or logically, with trans men, but if what you're saying is true, if you can explore your expression in whichever way you want, you can be this masculine thing and can have this masculine aesthetic and be expressing female gender. Now, I don't think it quite works that way, because I think gender is defined by secondary sex characteristics, which would include a beard. But this is why they don't really mean what they're saying. Okay? What they want is to explore labels in whichever way they want. And have other people use those labels in whichever way they want. They can dress up and act however they want and still be within the binary. Like I said, gender non-conforming. This means you don't have to delude yourself into thinking you're a new gender. You can just be comfortable not being stereotypical. Instead, you say if you aren't stereotypically masculine or feminine, you're neither, and you have to behave, and then you behave stereotypically non-binary. It's getting more rigid, not more flexible. It's like goths who think they're being rebels, but then they just wear the goth uniform and listen to the required goth music and become a clone of all the other goths. You think you're escaping one regimented culture only to jump headlong into another.
I have to perform or pretend to be someone that I'm not. I can be my authentic self.
It's really important for us to share more information with people because people are curious. They want to understand, but sometimes they don't always have the opportunities to do that.
You say this as if you're a benign, helpful individual who's an expert, who's just educating straight scientific facts. But what it really means to say, I want to give people opportunities to be educated and to have conversations, what it really means is listen to me and do as I say, or you're a bigot. I get to decide what you're allowed to think about me, and if you disagree with me, you need to be re-educated. This is the attitude of someone who thinks they have nothing to learn from the other side, that thinks they are the one to teach the whole world and they have nothing to learn from the world.
Welcome.
Hi.
You were watching the tape piece, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is a hot topic.
Yes.
That's a good thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Why is it a good thing?
I guess because it creates dialogue and it invites conversation to learn about other people.
Yeah.
No, it does not. Again, this is said in a nice way that can't really be argued with on its face, but dialogue and conversation to them really means is that they want you to come to them for the answers and they get to lecture you. They do not want to have an actual conversation about whether they're correct or not. They don't want to explore the merits of ideas. They don't want to explore other ideas. They just want to put their ideas out there and have you accept them. They don't even want to entertain the idea that they need to be corrected. They just want to correct you. They want to teach you about how to treat them, and they don't want to hear anything else. And I have proof of this. After this dialogue and conversation with Matt Walsh occurred, These two posted that they were having nightmares and depression and anxiety. They were not prepared for a discussion. They were prepared for lecturing us and us accepting with no pushback. They're liars. End of story.
And I think a lot of people are really confused about gender identity in these times. And
yeah, aka they don't agree with me. No possible way they're confused by gender identity, even though they cannot define man or woman, and by extension, non-binary. Notice how they have no way of knowing whether I'm talking about this single non-binary person or both of them when I say they.
It's good for us to have these conversations so people open their minds and relearn and unlearn to what we've been taught.
Right.
Yep. You need to be re-educated. I'm right, you're wrong. They just want to preach, not have a dialogue. This is just like religious fundamentalism.
And Addison, many people think gender pronouns are exclusive to the LGBTQ plus community, but that's a misconception, true?
Yeah. Well, everybody has pronouns. Like, you may use he and him as your pronouns, right? I use they and them as my pronouns.
No, you don't. This is factually untrue. You don't use they and them pronouns. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. In your general argument, you do not use they and them pronouns for yourself. That's not how pronouns work. That's not what they're for. Dr. Phil does not use he and him pronouns for himself. People around him who talk about him in the third person use he and him pronouns for him. Including you, Addison. You just assumed Dr. Phil's pronouns. Pronouns are not for you. Gendered pronouns are inherently third person for people to describe people other than themselves. You don't use your own pronouns. Unless you're talking about yourself in the third person, which is weird. So, because we have first person pronouns. That's grammatically correct. So try using a pronoun about yourself without using the third person. Try it. And try using first person gendered pronouns. The only first person pronouns are me, myself, and I. And those have never, ever, ever been gendered because there is no functional need for that. It would not clarify anything. We know the speaker is referring to itself whenever it says me, myself, mine, or I. But of course, the snowflakes have started to gender first-person pronouns as well, even though, again, there's no functional purpose for doing so.
Pronouns. We all may have a certain gender pronoun too, but I think it's important for people to understand that for trans and non-binary people, we often change our pronouns to reflect who we are when we come out and be who we are.
That's not what pronouns are for. They're not for reflecting who you are. They're for reflecting what you are, more specifically for other people to describe what you are. What you want is the fact that it makes you special and different, and it signifies this.
How do you explain the difference between sex and gender?
I consider sex to be our biological makeup. Our chromosomes, or hormones, our genitals is a biological makeup.
So keep this in mind for later when Addison asks what female means, as if Addison doesn't know this, as if this definition isn't just given for gender versus sex.
But our gender is more of an internal sense. So think of it like this. Sex is what's between the legs, and gender is what's between the ears, right? It's how we see ourselves on the inside.
All right, well, this is so vague as to be taken advantage of quite cruelly. This is sufficient to say, I'm a dragon. I see myself as a dragon or as emperor of the world. Yeah, I know this is such a typical response. Oh, I'm a dragon. But let's explore the actual implications. So, is dragon my gender? Is the way I see myself on the inside my gender? No. I see myself as skinny. Is that my gender? No. So where does the buck stop? What traits do I see myself as count as gender? This will never be defined. Because this is a wishy-washy, religious, dogmatic response that's just designed for feel-good, and it means nothing. Gender is inherently tied to sex. It is inherently based on sex. Gender is more akin to the expression of a sex. And again, you can biologically change your gender and sex. But for all intents and purposes, gender is they're essentially the same thing, gender and sex. Except for medical purposes, since we can't change all developmental or sex characteristics developmental characteristics tied to sex. A trans woman is still genetically male and has some medical history that may be relevant. For all other intents and purposes except reproduction and some sexual acts, sex is biologically mutable, and so is gender. So, yeah.
Okay. And that's something somebody can't know. Gender is something somebody can't know just by looking at somebody.
Nope. Yeah.
Oh boy. Addison, you just got done assuming Dr. Phil's gender just by looking at him, and you were right. You just said he may use he and him pronouns. How did you know this, Addison? And how were you so accurate? And how will this same methodology be accurate for 99% of people if you aren't supposed to be able to tell someone's gender by looking at someone? Even though you can 99% of the time. And even more if we're going to throw out the made-up genders like bug gender. How can 99% of people be 99% accurate at guessing someone's gender and guessing someone's self-identified gender just by looking at them? Very interesting. This is something that they will never ask themselves.
Because everyone is going to present and express themselves in a different way. I know it's very confusing, right? Everyone's like, what is going on? But
yes, everyone is confused because that's not what gender is for. Gender is not for expressing your inner thoughts and feelings. Period. That's not what that word means. That's not how pronouns have ever been used in the English language, at least until very recently. Gender and gendered pronouns are specifically and only for identifying people physically. There are terms for psychological states and opinions, and they aren't genders. Sad isn't a gender. Having a history as an abuse survivor isn't a gender. Being a gamer is not a gender. These things reflect someone who they are inside, but they aren't genders. Where is the line drawn? Who knows? These people won't tell you. Democrat and Republican, not genders. If we didn't have physical bodies, we would not have genders. So it is, at least not in the way that it's the English language uses them. It would mean something entirely different, even if we use the same label. So we might have pronouns for different personalities if we didn't have bodies, but they wouldn't be genders. Not in remotely the same usage. And we probably wouldn't use the same word. So everyone does express their gender differently. That doesn't mean there is a new gender for every potential expression. That just means that you might not be a stereotypical in your expression. Why are they not okay with this? What's the difference? Oh, because they don't get to have power over language, and they don't get to lecture people while posing as a savior, come to help them out of their delusions, even though they've been the ones using the words how everyone else uses them, the way languages work, and the gender activists are the ones using the new meanings and faulting everyone else for not automatically getting on the bandwagon. So, the majority of people are using language effectively, and the activists want to come in and say, you're doing it wrong. That's not how language works. So the mere fact that Addison is acknowledging that everyone is confused should tip you off that this is cultish behavior. Addison is claiming, Addison is aware that this is abnormal, that this should be raising eyebrows, that this is not how the language has worked, and yet Addison is claiming that indeed gender means something that the entire rest of the population doesn't know. Even though that's not how language works, how is this possible? It's not a new word. It's not an obscure word. It's a common word that's been in English parlance, meaning something else entirely. Either this is some esoteric, academia-only word, or Addison is attempting to redefine what it means and equivocate and asserting that this redefinition is correct, a prescriptive attitude instead of a descriptive attitude, which the latter is how language actually works, and the typical English definitions Addison claims are incorrect when the majority of English speakers use it that way, meaning that's what the word means, and the majority of English speakers have no fucking clue where this new usage of the word came from. Like I said, you're just here to accept this new speak and get with the program. You're not here to converse with them. You're not even here, let alone disagree and debate. You're not even here to ask challenging questions. You might be able to ask clarifying questions like, how can I get in the program with you? How can I get with the program? You're not here to converse with them about why and if it's a good usage of the word. Your role in this conversation, quote unquote, as far as they're concerned, is to do as you're told and shut up if you disagree, or else you're a bigot. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm totally wrong about everything I've said. They're legitimate concerns, and we should be able to get answers to these concerns. The fact that they won't answer these is very telling. Now, I'm normally a huge proponent of dictionary definitions, as you'll see from any argument anyone will have with basically communists or a religious people. Same thing, really. They'll try and equivocate and change definitions, and yeah, but occasionally you can see that certain definitions are changing due to movements or political pressures, which is fine because words change meaning, and it doesn't happen overnight. Everyone doesn't just switch meaning overnight, but I'll just give you the rundown. So gender is one of these words that is currently in flux because there's people using the same word differently. Fair enough. Dictionaries just report descriptions, but here's the problem with the descriptions. People are using this word to mean different things. Don't fault the dictionary for reporting that. But the people who are using the new version of the word are just causing confusion. They're not causing good communication. So we're now at the stage of where two groups of English speakers are attempting to use the same English word in opposite manners. It's not just like a little bit different. They're opposite, which makes communication between these groups utterly impossible. So, gender. Either of the two sexes, male and female, especially when considered with reference to social and cultural differences rather than biological ones. The term is also used to broadly denote a range of identities that do not correspond to established ideas of male and female. So, first of all, identity. What is an identity? It's being used to mean how someone sees themselves, but what it really is what a thing is. Your identity is what you are, period. It's just that the woke gender fundamentalists think that what you think you are is what you are. In some metaphorical sense, that's true. That's for fiction. That's for spirituality. That's not for what we're talking about here. That's like, okay, I have dragon energy, right? Or you have big dick energy. Maybe you don't have a big dick, but you act like you do. That's not what we're talking about. So, the reason trans people want to transition, there is a reason, right? Because there is an essence to what they're transitioning to. There's a reason why physical transition is a thing and not just mental. There's a reason why trans people don't just switch it in their brain. They want to have physical changes because gender is physical. So, bringing it back a bit, according to the dictionary, gender means male or female. Or not male or female. So, gender means nothing. Imagine if I told you that the word dog meant any breed of domesticated canine descended member of carnivora or any non-canine entity. It would mean everything and nothing. This is where we are with the word gender. Okay? Either of the two sexes or a range of identities that do not correspond with the ideas of the two sexes. Okay? Great. So, all right. I really digressed with that one.
It's really, about us breaking that assumption that we can tell someone's identity, someone's story, their pronouns, even their name, just based on how they look, right?
Excuse me? That's not what gender is for, okay? Gender is not for telling someone's identity or story. It's just for a rough physical description in how we can talk about them. It helps us distinguish who said what in situations. It helps us point out people in a crowd. And by the way, who thinks that you can tell your story based on how you look? Someone who looks poor versus wealthy, I mean, like, you can tell certain characteristics from how someone looks. But, again, these are not genders. Wealth is not a gender. I mean, not unless the bank wants to start recognizing my billionaire gender, but then I'm all for it, honestly. Yeah, I think what it is these gender activists want attention. They want their story and inner being to be told through their pronouns, even more than their name, because their name could be anything. Names don't really tell a story. They're just random labels. What names literally are just distinguishing labels and aesthetic labels. That's what they want to do to pronouns, which is not what pronouns are for. The neo-pronouns like Zer, bug, and bug self.
I just added bug to my list of pronouns, so...
What they're doing is they want us to know something more about them. That they're special. They're not like the other people. They're different. Someone who rejects gender norms, rejects the binary, rejects language convention and traditional communication, and even wants to be a bug. But Addison even said telling someone's name from the way they look. What maniac thinks that they can do that? How is this a straw man Addison even wants to create? No one is even trying to do this. This reveals a really fundamental conflation these people are making, which is that of conflating things like life experience and name with labels and pronouns. Names, which are different and unique to every person, are not good enough for these people. Even a name can reflect a little on your personality, especially if you choose it or someone gives you a nickname. But they want pronouns to reflect their whole life story and be unique labels. In addition to names, they want new labels, like costumes they can try on. They're auditory and linguistic costumes to these people.
It's really about what sort of feels good to our ears when we hear it.
And they even admit they're devoid of actual meaning. So what's left? Just the label for the label's sake. We already have that. It's called a name, and it actually is more than just a label. Right.
Yeah. And so how does someone ask? How does somebody clarify that? Ethan, what's the best way? What's the most comfortable way?
I think for me, to create a safe space for people to share their pronouns, I will say, hi, my name is Ethan. I use he or they pronouns. What about you?
What an unbelievably inefficient and awkward way to communicate with people just out in the world. Imagine starting every conversation like this. Most people are not even going to know what the hell you're talking about. Not to mention, it's completely useless. Never are you going to use a pronoun when talking to someone, only when you're talking about them. Again, second person pronouns are not gendered, just like first person pronouns. You're not going to use your pronouns ever on yourself, and someone is never going to use your pronouns to you. It's only when they're talking about you in third person. These people just want attention. When am I ever going to use a pronoun, any pronoun other than you, when I'm talking directly to you? Never.
So when I introduce myself, I generally say, hi, my name's Sam Britton. I use they and them as my pronouns.
Hi, my name is so-and-so, and I use they and them pronouns. Look, it's literally an extension of their name. This is how they think pronouns should be used, but it's categorically not what they're for. I mean, and how much time is wasted in explaining this? It's like an NPC in Skyrim walking up to you and telling you their life story, person after person. Instead, with normal pronouns, you can communicate this non-verbally. For the vast majority of people, their gender has a definition. It has a basis in nature. They're born with a particular body type, behaviors, and preferences that are all categorically correlated. Yes, there's some flexibility, and that's the whole point of gender nonconformity. These activists want to take that away and exclude those conceptions of identity just so a tiny percentage of people will receive positive reinforcement for their bastardization of language. The truth is, pronouns are not yours. They're not for you, period. They're for other people to identify you. They don't reference your internal thoughts and feelings or your life story. Those are nouns and adjectives. Do I have an angry gender right now? Am I snake reptilian gender if I personally identify with the plight of the reptiles? Gendered pronouns are specifically and exclusively for other people to refer to you in the third person, to other people, so that we know who we're talking about. So when idiots like Ben Shapiro call Blair White by male pronouns, that's also a bastardization of language, since no one would understand who Ben is referring to, since, again, gender is based on physical traits, not chromosomes. Yes, XY and XX genotypes can both create the same phenotype, or both end up as the same phenotype. Understanding of gender and sex predate the discovery of chromosomes by hundreds of thousands of years. Even Ben Shapiro had to admit to Blair White in his conversation with her that for functional purposes, he would have to refer to Blair with female pronouns if pointing her out to other people, just to be able to communicate at all.
My argument would be, I did the Michael Knowles show over at you guys' studios a while back, and he was sort of expressed to me that he was sort of feeling conflicted with the person he was sitting and interacting with, and the fact that he, has the same stance as you typically on pronouns. And the thing that came up was, well, if you and I were to go to a business dinner or any kind of dinner, and you were meeting me at a restaurant, and I was there first, and I was in an orange shirt, and you had to tell, the host, I'm here to meet my friend Blair, and they said, okay, and you had to describe me to take me to the table, you wouldn't say the man in the orange shirt, you would say Blair, you would say her over there. So for me, it's about sort of real world application of it. The thing that I hate the most is being expected in these conversations to sort of suspend my reality of how social interaction really works outside of the debate. So what do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think there's some truth to that, meaning that I think that there is a utility to the use of pronouns, but that's not quite the same as suggesting that a transgender woman is a she in the objective sense. So if I were to go to dinner with you and there were to be a waiter there and I were to direct the waiter to you, obviously we would go based off your physical appearance, but the argument for transgender people is that if you looked like me, you could still be transgender woman, right? That you wouldn't actually have to go through surgery, you wouldn't have to actually go through hormone treatments, you wouldn't have to go through any of that to be perceived as a woman. And therefore, if it would actually be assuming pronouns for me to be sitting at dinner and you to walk up and say, that dude sitting over there, right? You'd actually be assuming my pronoun if I were a transgender woman.
Exactly.
And this is the part where it gets into this really bizarre space that makes no sense to me, meaning that, obviously, in terms of utilitarian effect, you're right. If I were to walk into dinner and try and describe you, you look like a woman, therefore, to the person there, I wouldn't be trying to explain who you were or your background, because what's the point of that?
But then he'll turn around and deliberately use male pronouns for trans women just to virtue signal that he's not down with the trans agenda.
I refuse to use pronouns that do not apply to biological sex.
So they go out of their way to call trans people by their biological sex when 99% of the time it's completely inappropriate, and I've even seen them stutter and mess up and call them by their correct pronouns, or even have existential crises about trying to remember their biological sex instead of what they look like. I've seen them struggle to hold back their attractions, and then they catch themselves. It's sad. Why do they feel the need to point out biological male this and biological that? How is this fact relevant? They hide behind, well, it's a biological fact, but this fact is not relevant. And it's not relevant to the gender. If you see a trans woman and call her he, or just preface every opening statement with that she's trans or a biological male, what are you actually communicating? Because you're absolutely no possible way just honestly communicating some random fact that they were born male. Why are you bringing that up? No, you're communicating the fact that you're disgusted, and we should all be disgusted and super interested in what's in their pants for some reason. What relevancy does it have if you're looking at someone like Blair White? Let's see, nothing. You could say that it's relevant because you might want to have a baby with her. No, you're not dating her. You aren't proposing to date or have sex with her. You aren't engaged to marry her. She's just a person talking and standing there. For our purposes, her genitals and genetics are irrelevant. So, why are these conservatives so obsessed with the logistics of fucking everyone they're talking about?
Boner alert.
This is Buck Angel. He's a trans man, born a female, currently still has a vagina. This is Blair White, a trans woman. The idea that Buck Angel here is more of a woman than Blair White here is a total bastardization of language. Would it be appropriate for him to go into the female restroom? Would it be appropriate for her to go into the male restroom? And would you even be able to check? The pronouns are not for describing genitals or chromosomes. We've been using these pronouns since before genetics even existed. They're for social purposes, roughly describing secondary sex characteristics. Otherwise, you need to check everyone's pants and perform genetic tests on them to gender them. But no, we've been doing this for a long time without checking anyone's pants, without genetic testing. So that proves my thesis. So they're irrelevant. We don't do that when gendering people. Because here's a secret. There's passable trans people out there. And you wouldn't know unless you peeked in their pants or they told you. There's probably a bunch that you've never even thought twice about. You thought they were cis. Never noticed. Even then, there are genetically male people with natural vaginas from birth. The only solution to all these facts is my thesis that gender is based on secondary sex characteristics. So, the only possible social function a reference to gender has to someone you aren't planning on dating for the purposes of having a child or having sex with them is a physical description of their secondary sex characteristics. If I were to refer to Homer Simpson as a she, no one would follow my sentence, even if he internally felt like a woman. Right? So, that said, there's also no possible relevancy for the non-binary pronouns. What function does this serve? You might say, well, it communicates that they're androgynous, that they're a mix of both genders, or a lack of both genders. That whole thing, it's either both or neither. That's also quite confusing. So that spectrum is so broad, it's actually meaningless in yet another fractal way. As we see on stage here, non-binary could span from a trans man to a feminine man with a beard to a totally androgynous, hairless, alien-looking thing. It could be anything. It doesn't actually inform anything. It's not informative, so it's not communicative. It's not good use of language. So it actually still does not give us any unique picture of what we're talking about. And you might think, oh, I'm prescribing language here. Not really. I'm attempting to describe language, and it's not possible. Therefore, it is a useless word, and words have meaning based on their uses. So, if I don't know what the meaning is, and I can't use the word, how is it even really a word? It's just noise at this point. And, so they've invented so many additional pronouns because they want them to describe every possible personality or fashion or expression, which just makes the pronouns into a new mini language on their own and creates tons of rigid little boxes that if you step outside of them, you're a new gender. He who controls the language controls the masses. If anything, we should have a gender pronoun for each little personality difference, but at that point, it's just way too much. You'd have to learn thousands of new languages or thousands of new words. Pronouns are meant to be simple and concise and limited. They're not supposed to be part of a giant codex of adjectives. We already have those. They aren't meant to be subtle or nuanced. They're hard and fast heuristics. Pronouns are important when it comes to trans people because they don't want to be treated as a man in a dress. It helps us distinguish between a man in a dress and a legitimate trans woman, which is important because trans women are not just men in dresses. That's a drag queen or just a man in a dress who enjoys wearing a dress. What's wrong with that? Nothing. Doesn't make it a new gender. So, what is the function? What is the purpose? What actual function do neopronouns serve to these people? It's not communicating anything meaningful other than ideological. It's to feel different, to be special. What they're saying is they're so special among humans that normal words aren't good enough for them. And somewhat subtly, somewhat explicitly communicates that they're just being gender non-conforming to the current fashion stereotypes is not good enough for them. For some reason. And the reason is They want something about their ideology recognized. Well, I'm digressing a lot today.
I think it's really important for us to recognize other people's pronouns because, again, we can't make that assumption. But for so many...
You did not 10 seconds ago, Addison. You assumed Dr. Phil's pronouns based on his physical appearance, which you said you shouldn't do either of. So you actually are much better off assuming pronouns. The majority of trans people, if asked what their pronouns, are going to be thinking inside, isn't it obvious what I'm trying to be doing here? Am I not passing? Is it not obvious what I'm trying to look like? Asking someone's pronouns is pushed for the sake of, for lack of a better word, and the androgynous folks out there. It's coming from someone who is quite often described as androgynous. I'm not offended by this language, so the so-called gender terrorists who revel in confusing people and maybe who don't do anything to feminize themselves other than wear a dress just to mess with people, just to like freak them out, or why change your gender at all? If not to look like the opposite gender, why change the pronoun? If you're not going to put in the work, what's the point? Attention, to feel special, or because woke activists convince them that if you feel different from the other girls, it means maybe you're not a girl. Maybe you're not a girl or a boy. And us adults can barely wrap our heads around this. So teaching kids is just beyond confusing. They're very suggestible.
My daughter went home crying, shaking, so afraid that she could turn into a boy.
People who are cisgender, meaning that you do identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth, you're not transgender or not non-binary. I think a lot of people don't even question their pronouns because we already use them and it's already assumed correctly. But for so many trans and non-binary...
Right, Addison. Most people can use this system with no problem whatsoever, but because you are a special snowflake, you're special. So we should all change our perfectly functional system to make you feel more in control.
People that isn't often assumed correctly. So we need to take the time to get to know people.
No, that is not what gender and pronouns are for. They don't inform you about getting to know someone. They're not for getting to know people. Never have been. They don't function that way for cis people. Even if you guess correctly, you don't know anything about me if you know my pronouns. Look, I don't tell people my pronouns. I don't know if you've noticed. It's happened a few times. I get asked my pronouns. I don't give them, and I won't be doing anytime soon. You get to make that decision. I do this on principle, because they're not mine. They're for you to describe me. Okay? I'm not going to say these people are full-on malignant narcissists, but they've got a little bit of narcissism, okay? Maybe a little too much. I have narcissistic traits. I think it's a little bit of healthy narcissism. Everyone needs a little bit. I think they're going a little too far because they need perfect strangers to do extra work to get to know them, quote unquote, to even have the most basic of interactions. Here's a piece of life advice. More valuable than anything I've said so far. Nobody cares who you are. Get used to it. I know, harsh. I want people to be nice to these people. I'd be nice to these people. I sympathize with them. They're clearly very desperate for recognition, and we all are. I'm not faulting them for that. That's not a negative. They want someone to care and acknowledge who they are. We all deserve that. But reality's a bitch. You're one tiny little fish in a giant ocean, okay? Be glad for the people you know because they care about you. They care who you are. they actually want to have a relationship with you. But people you're just meeting, people who are just learning your pronouns, they don't care. Nobody knows you just because of your pronouns. But they think that's what pronouns are for. For getting to know you. That's not the point. Cis people do not have this privilege. I don't know why they think non-cis people should have this in their pronouns either. I don't know Dr. Phil. I don't know anything about him. Just because I know he identifies as male or is identified as male, that's the extent of what I know about him. I know some physical characteristics, some probable physical characteristics. That's it. I don't know anything about him, who he is as a person.
Gender, it says adjective that describes a person whose gender identity matches or aligns with the gender he or she was assigned at birth. Now, this would be what has been traditional for centuries, right? Mm-hmm. Why does it need a term?
You know, if we don't use that term, then we end up saying maybe real men or normal men or regular men, right? Or we just say men, and then we say maybe transgender men, right? And the thing is that we need to realize that trans women are women. Trans men are men too.
Again, you aren't assigned something at birth. You're just born with these sex characteristics. The doctor notes it, and that's the end of the story. But this is one of the few good points Addison makes throughout this. Somewhat well. Calling cis people normal men or real women is quite offensive to trans people, and more importantly, highly inaccurate. If you want to make the distinction, cis or really fertile might be a better option, but I mean, is it really offensive to be excluded from the normal category? I would say no, it shouldn't be. Maybe we should just focus on destigmatizing being abnormal. Nothing wrong with it. Just as if we were to talk about normal-sized people versus dwarves or little people, we all know what's normal, what a normal biology is, what normal behaviors are. They just don't want you to say it, as if there should be some stigma attached to not being normal. There's nothing wrong with that. As if being normal is somehow shameful, or being abnormal, not normal, somehow shameful. Let your freak flag fly, honey. Screw the normies. They're boring anyway. But we all know what normal is. And I don't think it's offensive. But yeah, I think it is important to be inclusive because, okay, so normal, yeah, I think normal woman, while could be offensive, accurate, real woman, to exclude trans women, I think trans women are real women. They're not normal women by any means. So I think Addison is hitting on something important here. Doesn't quite hit it home. Let's move on.
And so we just want to have a term for that privilege, that assumption that your gender identity is going to match the one that you were assigned at birth.
Okay. It's not a privilege. What do cis people get from this? I don't understand what the privilege is. No one knows anything more about cis people. The privilege is that you don't have to have gender dysphoria. That's the privilege. It's not like cis people get money or power or euphoria even from being cisgender. The privilege is not sticking out, not attracting the disgust of bigots, and not having gender dysphoria. Gender euphoria is experienced by trans people who have lived so long under the yoke of being trapped in the wrong gender, and they're finally living what they've always meant to live. And yeah, I suppose cis people can have gender euphoria where, oh yeah, I just feel like such a man right now. Or a woman gives birth and she just really feels like a woman. Or whatever makes her feel womanly. Sure. People can have that privilege. It's not necessarily a privilege of being cis. I don't think Addison knows what the privilege that's really going on here is. The idea of non-binary is it's just not fitting in here. I'll explain further in a bit, but remember this point. The point about privilege.
All right, and then transgender adjective describes a person whose gender identity does not match or align with the gender they were assigned at birth. And then non-binary describes a person whose gender identity does not fit into the traditional binary of man or woman. And that term can be abbreviated to, and how do you pronounce that?
NB.
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 So, yes, trans fits into the gender binary. Makes sense. Non-binary doesn't. Identity does not fit into the binary of man or woman. So, what is a gender then? What is neither man nor woman? None of these questions are ever answered. They can't even answer what a man or woman is, so how do they know they aren't one? And why do they co-opt trans activism to push non-binary gender expansionism when trans people are binary? Why is tomboy or femboy not good enough for these people? What's the point? Literally, I don't see the point. What point are they making? They say it's to be recognized, how they relate to their gender, but what does that mean? I don't care how you feel inside. For the relevancy here, gender and pronouns are not for describing what you feel inside. The point of changing your gender is to match the physical outside with what you feel inside. So there's going to be an inside component, but the outside is also a component.
Yeah.
Okay, and explain that.
For transgender people, we are assigned a sex at birth.
This is one of my pet peeves. No, you're not. You're assigned a name at birth. Are you assigned an eye color? No. The doctor just writes what color your eyes are. And the doctor just writes what genitals you have. Okay? That's it.
And when we grow up, when there's a mismatch of how we view ourselves and how society views us, then we can choose to, either medically transition or just socially transition or both. Not every transgender person chooses to medically transition. For me, I chose to medically transition to feel comfortable in my own skin.
Nothing wrong with that. All power to you. But I ask, why do you feel good? Why do you feel that you would be more comfortable in your own skin if you looked a certain way? Is it maybe that there's a certain gender tied physically to a certain physical body type? I know, crazy, right? Otherwise you could just not change your body or your look at all and use a pronoun that communicates that you feel different inside from the other girls and boys. But no, there's something in the physical that you need to change, isn't there? Remember this, because this is of vital importance.
And this is different from, being non-binary and stuff too, because for many non-binary people, they might identify as trans because they don't identify with that gender assigned at birth.
That doesn't make you trans. Trans is binary. flip one to the other. Even in chemistry, a molecule can be either cis or trans. There's not an in-between. What makes one trans is if they go from one gender to the other. Not if they leave gender or take both genders or become a bug. Because, I mean, bug, not a gender. It's a species. Transspeciesism might be a thing. Let's not get into that because that's not... I don't want to do the whole, you think you can switch genders? That's like switching species. No, they're not comparable. That's what Matt Walsh, we'll get to that. We'll get to that.
But for a lot of non-binary people, it means that you just don't exclusively identify as a man or woman. And
so why would you care if someone used a pronoun that you identify with? Because you feel like they need to know that you identify with both? Honey, who cares? If you identify with both, why not take both? I like vanilla and chocolate. You have to give me both vanilla and chocolate. Why, if you identify with both, why wouldn't you just take one or the other?
under that, there's a whole umbrella of gender identities where people might have pronouns that change day to day. There might be people...
How obnoxious. Like, seriously, just obnoxious and self-centered. That's like someone changing their name all the time. Just get over yourself. This is going too far. Like, this is barely even debatable. Going this far, changing your pronoun day to day. People need consistency to be able to communicate about you. And if I have to constantly check in with you and keep a running spreadsheet, well, fuck you. Honestly, just fuck off. You've lost the plot completely at that point. You've now conflated gender with mood. Do you see what I mean about these people destroying gender? Destroying language and the meaning of words? You don't get your own pronouns. You get your own proper noun, aka a name. You can pick your name. I'll call you whatever name you want. You want me to call you Schneebles? I'll call you Schneebles. You want me to call you Cat Person or Lion-O? I'll call you that. You want your name to be Bug? I'll call you Bug. But you do not get to demand that I describe you in a certain way, which includes pronouns, nouns, adjectives, adverbs, etc. I will not describe you as a non-human being, for example. A name is an identifier that carries no other necessary meaning. It is just a label, unlike pronouns. But if you change your name every day and demand I keep up, fuck you. Just same thing. No, I'm not doing homework just to let you play childish games lest you become offended. At that point, I hope I offend you. Stay away from me. I don't need people like that in my life. If you're a coworker or subordinate or superior in a professional setting, this should be seen as an unprofessional request, not appropriate for the workplace or classroom. It's hard enough to remember one name, let alone changing every day. With their framework, this does logically follow from their deconstruction of gender that you can change your pronoun all the time. So their fundamental premise is severely flawed if this is where you can logically go.
There might be people who have one set of pronouns for the rest of their life. You might have non-binary people too who are fluid with their gender identities in itself. It's very confusing, very nuanced, but I think that what you were
yeah, let's preach it to the children as they're developing, right?
Talking about earlier, with it being that maybe traditionally, for centuries, people have identified with maybe the gender that they were assigned at birth. When we look at history, and we look at cultures too around the world, we see that third, fourth, fifth genders have always been around. And then in different cultures, the idea of what gender is or a relation to our bodies is completely different than maybe here in the United States.
I don't think this is actually true. There are other gender expressions and gender roles, to be sure, but not genders. as we understand them in the English language. Addison kind of admits it here, how we define it in the United States. So again, Addison's concern is the label and not the meaning of the label. This is the equivocation fallacy, demanding a double meaning of the same word. In our language, gender relates to the sexes, of which humans are sexually dimorphic. Two sexes. This is a fact. So, for example, the Native American term two-spirit, in which there are different ritual and social roles. Well, first of all, I thought these guys, like myself, were against rigid social roles for genders. So I'm not sure why they would want to create a new rigid role where two-spirit, well, you have a specific role in society if you're two-spirit. No gender has a specific role other than what they're biologically capable of. Okay? Even then, these people are going to argue men can get pregnant, etc. So, get out of here with your gender roles. Two-spirit is a gender role. We don't like those. None of those for me, thank you. So, two-spirit would simply be someone who doesn't conform with the traditional roles and behaviors of their biological sex and gender. I mean, if we're giving them the benefit of the doubt and not saying it has a rigid gender role, which is really what it was in practice. But, so why is there a third gender for this? Why isn't there just a societal role that can be held by men or women? So I don't think it makes sense to call it a gender. It's a role that they tied to maybe some androgyny. I don't know. So sure, we can label it, we can describe it, a two-spirit person, but what's the point of using gendered pronouns for this? Nothing. We can still tell the biological sex of these people, and their role in society should not be defined by their gender. So now I will say perhaps there's a function in using a different new pronoun to describe a feminine looking person with a penis or a masculine person with a vagina. But let's take that to its logical extent. Where does that stop? Does it apply to butch lesbians or only trans men? And why would we put a pronoun to it? By that logic, we have to put a pronoun on anything and everything. Trees would have their own pronouns. Dogs would have their own pronouns. It never ends. What would be the point? At that point, they're just nouns. And like, why do I need to know what genitals look like? It's irrelevant. Genitals and fertility are only relevant in specific relationships. You don't need to know. We've been over this. It's about secondary sex characteristics. That's what gender really comes down to. That's what's relevant in 99% of interactions to 99% of these people doing these interactions. That's all you need to know about someone when you look at them on the street. Okay.
I have a gender pronoun chart that I got really confused about, and I'm just admitting straight up, this chart, I didn't know how to use the chart, and we don't need to go through the whole thing, but there were like just using co.
Not all these pronouns I think I even recognize too, which is okay, right? I think at the end of the day too, people.
So you don't recognize words, but you're trying to communicate something, but you don't even know what it means. Again, people want to have this whole liturgy and discussion when meeting people about what their pronoun means and blah, 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 blah. No one cares.
Will have different pronouns beyond he or she or even they, which, I use in a singular context for myself. But as you can see...
So why are you making communicating with random people into a trivia game? I have a hard enough time remembering people's names. So now you have to add something else, which the only function will be to get offended by and to confuse the hell out of everyone else. Even if we add new genders, you don't get to just make up your own on the spot. They need to be somewhat standardized and predictable. You need to be able to tell what their pronoun is without having to talk to them, because pronouns are used in third person. So how are you supposed to talk about someone if you haven't ever met them? And how would you know what pronouns to use? Again, we can't talk about a person without going in and surveying their personal thoughts and feelings. Unless we use pronouns the way we've traditionally used them, then normal social interaction is possible. And using they, them in a singular context, it actually can be very confusing. There are several points along this entire talk where I've said they, them, and you have no idea whether I've been talking about just Addison or both Addison and Ethan. And I've been doing that deliberately because it's impossible to know. I could be talking about both in almost every instance that I've been using it. And actually, the entire time, I have been using them to refer to both of them. But there are several times when I was talking, meaning both of them, where I realized I could be talking about just Addison. Now I've just confused everything because you have no idea without me having to tell you. Okay? So, traditional pronouns are actually communicating more information about people, places, and things. Okay? So, and I can't tell you how many times I've been confused when other people use the terms just like that. So, it does work, they, them, even though it's grammatically, technically incorrect. I don't care. It works when the singular is an unknown entity because we're talking about a multitude of possibilities, which would include both genders. It's like a group of people that could be the singular person you're talking about. So it works. And it actually communicates an unknown, right? And is used when a singular is already specified. So, I'm getting off in the weeds.
There's an ongoing evolution of language and how people can identify. If you're unsure how to use someone's pronouns after that person has disclosed what their pronouns are, just ask, clarify. I just want to make sure that I'm using your pronouns in the correct way.
Do you know?
What a clunky and useless way to interact with people. Again, I get asked what my pronouns are sometimes, and it's like, bruh, this is awkward. I don't care. Again, personal feelings do not make language usage correct. Communicability does.
What, XIE?
So you say Z.
Z?
Mm-hmm.
But then there is a Z right below.
Mm-hmm. There's different ways to spell and pronounce pronouns. It's complicated and nuanced, but it's important for us to understand that complexity.
My next guest has been criticized online for his views about gender identity. His reply may surprise you. That's next.
Moving a little faster now. Hopefully we can speed this up a little.
My name is Matt Walsh, and I've written a book called Johnny the Walrus. This book is about identity and imagination. He identifies as a walrus, and his mom's a little silly. She takes it seriously and thinks he really is a walrus. So she went on her phone, and there were people telling her that this isn't pretend, he's really a walrus. And his mother takes him to the doctor to have him surgically transitioned, and gets him walrus hormone pills, and then eventually tries to drop him off at a zoo to live with other walruses. Not only topping the Amazon charts, my book has taken the world by storm.
Okay, so in comes Matt Walsh, an obnoxious conservative commentator who only dislikes trans people because of his religion and his fundamentalist religion and because of his political tribe. He just thinks they're icky. But let's see what he has to say. As far as his book is concerned, it's an attack on the very concept of transitioning sex, which is not what I've been attacking so far. And while I get the analogy of a walrus, I get it, but it needs to be stated. The analogy kind of holds as an analogy-ish, but I need to state human genders are not different species of organism, so it's not quite apt. We know of several species of organism that can change biological reproductive sex, so it's we don't know of any species that can change species, and changing traits that exist within your species is different from changing traits without your species. That's completely different. So let's go on.
Well, you just saw my next guest, author and conservative host of Daily Wire's The Matt Walsh Show, talking about his recently published children's book that has since been removed online by a popular large retail chain. Now, Matt says gender is not a social construct, but rooted firmly in biology. True?
True, absolutely. Well,
yes, gender is rooted in biology. That doesn't mean you can't change it, because here's the thing. Biology is mutable. That any biologist knows that biology is very flexible. But it does mean you can't be bug gender or non-gender.
Actually, just to clarify, and with all due respect, but most of what we just heard in the previous segment was total nonsense, which is why when you were pushing for definitions and that sort of thing, they were not able to provide it because it's just nonsensical. Sex, well, as human beings, we have a sex, male or female. That is a biological scientific fact. Now, gender is a linguistic term. Words have gender. People don't.
Yeah. This is actually, I think this is correct. In a sense, words are gendered in order to describe physical characteristics. At least in English. The Romance languages, as much as I love Spanish and I despise French,
loathe entirely,
they have genders for almost every noun, and I think this communicates absolutely nothing in the majority of cases and just causes needless clunkiness in the language, especially in learning them. Different languages have different pronouns for people of different ages or social status or familiarity with the subject. Yeah, I've always thought this was completely ridiculous, and I outright refuse to use them. Like in Japanese, I don't know Japanese, but if I speak Spanish, I outright refuse to use the formal usted pronouns. I strictly use the to pronouns as the second person, informal you pronouns. It's useless. The formal pronouns, personally, I find it disrespectful to expect me to be formal. First of all, to expect me to use different language just like you're special, you're just as much of a snowflake as these people. If you need a special pronoun, it is fundamentally useless. It's the same thing. I'm talking to you, adding some social construct of respect doesn't do anything. I'm just uttering a different syllable. So it means the same thing. If I fail to use the formal pronouns, someone I don't know will be offended because I didn't utter the correct noise. That means the exact same thing as the informal second person pronoun. So just fuck off. So I'm extremely consistent about this principle across languages, across time. But again, I digress. We are just talking about English. English correctly does not recognize these useless and confusing pronoun conventions because there's no point. And again, what I just described are not gendered. They're not different genders. They don't even go that far. But I still think it's ridiculous.
You're saying that there should be no construct of gender, just sex. You're either male or female.
Right.
And someone feeling in a mental, emotional way that they don't identify with the sex that they have been biologically created as and assigned at birth based on their genitalia. If they don't feel that way, that there's no construct that describes that, experiences that.
Well, that's got nothing to do with the realities. You can feel however you want. I mean, I could sit here and say that I feel like a tomato plant, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually in those things. So your self-perception, you can have whatever self-perception you want, but you can't expect me to take part in that self-perception or to take part in this kind of charade, this theatrical production.
Yes, you're not a tomato plant just because you think you are. You aren't a bug because you say you are. And non-binary makes about as much sense as that. So, however, if you think referring to trans woman as he is at all useful and not just theatric virtue signaling, if you think referring to those people referring to a trans woman as she is theatrical, you're crazy. It's just accurate. These are all trans women, by the way. So if you refer to them as he, you're the one being theatrical. You're the one playing the charades. And you aren't even a woman just because you say you are. You need to actually take steps to actually become one, because it has a definition. A transition is a process, and there's a reason it's a transition from one thing to another physically, or else you could just do it in your mind and it would be done. But no, don't get me started about erasing the struggles of trans people. Because that is the logical progression of these people's argument. Is that you should just, if it's not physically tied, then that erases the entire gender dysphoria struggle, the diagnosis, the condition, medical condition.
You don't get your own pronouns, just like you don't get your own prepositions or your own adjectives. You know, it's like if I...
Yep. Been saying this for a long time. Absolutely true. You can describe yourself however you want, but other people can also describe you however they want, whatever way seems apt to them. And I think we all kind of understand this. You can see yourself as righteous and forthright, upstanding citizen, and I can call you a backstabbing, hypocritical piece of crap. You can argue about the accuracy of what I call you, but you don't get to decide for me what words I'm going to use to describe you. And maybe I use offensive words. That's my prerogative. Only the facts should dictate who wins this argument, unless we're talking about preference. But obviously we're not.
Were to tell you, my adjectives are handsome and brilliant. And no matter, whenever you're talking about me, you have to describe me as handsome and brilliant because that's how I identify. Makes no sense. You don't get your own pronouns. That's grammar. That's language.
So you...
Precisely true. This is the exact same principle. I was waiting to make this argument because he makes it. I didn't want to jump the gun. It's the exact same thing. The argument for using the wrong pronoun is that it's offensive and denies the person's self-identity, how they see themselves. Okay, well, guess what? I can do the very same thing with adjectives. I could call you ugly when you think you're pretty. This denies your self-identification. your identity. I can call you dumb when you think you're smart. This denies your identity. I violated the exact same principle of identity as that of pronouns, and yet we don't take the same offense. It's not like you're a bigot. You might be being offensive, yes, but we accept that kind of offense. We accept that we're allowed to call each other stupid or, whatever. We accept this, but yet pronouns, disagreeing on someone's pronouns is treated different than disagreeing about someone's adjectives. Why? It's the exact same principle. If I use adjectives that go against your self-identity, how is this any different than using adjectives using pronouns that go against your self-identity, your self-image? And again, I can't stress this enough. You don't get to use gendered pronouns to talk to a person or about yourself. Gendered pronouns are exclusively for talking about someone in the third person. First person and second person pronouns don't need genders because it is known who the pronouns are directed toward or from. To gender these would, again, communicate only internal thoughts and feelings. Pronouns are not meant for communicating this personality or life history. The gender activists are demanding that other people use specific words for them. Demanding this for pronouns is no different from demanding this of adjectives or even nouns. So, not doing this would deny a person's self-identification. The gender activists have nothing to refute someone who demands to be called a trans-dimensional dragon. No principle at all. That's their identity, trans-dimensional dragon. So now with the same approach I lay out, gender being defined by an aggregate of secondary sex characteristics, we can destroy both the transphobes with science and facts, and we get to tell the bug genders to go fuck themselves too. Alright? If gender's however you define it, then being a woman is whatever you define it as, and then I can define it to be the President of the United States. And if you deny it, you're denying my gender identity, as long as I call myself that label. And this isn't hyperbole. I'm not trolling, I'm not joking, I'm not being sarcastic, I'm not exaggerating, I'm not being sardonic. I identify. That's how I identify. I really think that I should be president of the United States. I'm not joking. I'm being absolutely serious. The only thing I don't believe in that argument is that woman is an appropriate label for that self-identification. But nor is male, nor is any pronoun, but going by Addison and Ethan's arguments, you must recognize my identity as president, and therefore you must recognize whatever label I use to describe myself as president, whatever pronoun label, and you must recognize that definition, that I am that definition in reality, as long as I identify with that label that I've assigned to it. So this is the death of the meaning of the label and the death of the meaning of the concept in reality. So they have no defense against me declaring myself as their president, their god, as their dragon, god emperor at this point, or else they're denying my identity. Same principle. They can't be consistent. I can, on principle. But everyone, including the gender activists, will tell me I can't just define myself into the presidency. I can't just define myself into being a dragon. So there is a limit on what a gender means, implicitly, but they will never actually admit this or tell you where the line is, because they haven't done the work of figuring out where that limit is, because they don't want to question themselves, and they don't want a hard limit, because they want it to be vague enough so there are no limits when it benefits them, but they can always stop and tell other people to stop when they think someone else is going too far. But they have no principle to say where that limit is. It's just wherever they want it to be, because they have no principle. They have no credibility. They'll just say what gender isn't, just like Addison will say they're not a woman, but won't actually say what a woman is. And therefore, how do you know that you aren't something if you don't even know what it is? You can't. In reality, gender is used to express someone's proximity to a standard reproductive biological sex, usually using secondary sex characteristics, because there are biologically two types of humans. End of story. Yes, those two types are broad. Yes, there's a whole spectrum. But that's it. Why would Addison not be a man just because of the long hair and the makeup and the dress? This makes no sense unless Addison is proposing rigid male social construct, gender roles, and fashion stereotypes. No, Addison wants to avoid the implications attached to the standard pronouns, but instead really wants to thrust these stereotypes onto the rest of us.
You think it's a delusion? Someone is self-delusional.
Yeah, I think it's delusion. It could be mental illness. It could be it's a lot of different things. With children,
it's actually attention-seeking behavior. In the case of trans-binary people, transition is a treatment for mental illness. There's nothing wrong with this. Don't stigmatize mental illness. Matt Walsh just doesn't like it because it's icky. Yes, maybe it would be better to just get rid of gender dysphoria without having to physically transition. Maybe there's a pill for that. I'm sure a lot of people would take it. The best and most effective transition, though, that exists at this moment for most people with gender dysphoria is gender transition. That's just the science. Don't get me wrong. Transition could be the wrong treatment for a lot of people too, especially if we're diagnosing this in children, and it should be treated with the utmost caution because there are consequences, okay? But it is a legitimate medical treatment.
Wow. You know, there's also just a basic confusion that all kids have. Like, that's why when you hear someone, a parent say, "Oh, my 4-year-old son came to me and said that I'm a girl now, and so that's what I'm gonna raise him as a girl." No, you're a 4-year-old. I have 4 kids. When a 4-year-old boy comes to you and says, "Oh, I'm a girl," here's a good follow-up question. What is a girl? Ask him what he means by that.
Yes. That is a great follow-up question, especially for children who might not fully understand the implications. But notice Matt is going for the child transition angle and not talking about the adults. And he's kind of conflating the idea that transition is appropriate with the non-binary gender activist ideology, which it goes way further than binary transsexuals. He's kind of conflating transsexualism with the broader wokeist BS, when one is true, the other is not. So, yes, we do need extra caution with children because they're very ignorant and suggestible. I think this is the least controversial part of the trans conversation, although a lot of people will take offense to this. There are zealots on both sides who either essentially force their kids to transition or who would forbid it under all circumstances, both of which are uninformed and fundamentalist.
What do you mean by girl? And when you ask him that, here's what he'll tell you. He will tell you what he really means is that he wants to do some of the things that girls do, like play with the dollhouse, or you know, he likes the color pink. That's fine, play with the dollhouse, but you're still a boy.
Somehow, I doubt Matt Walsh would be okay with his male children playing with feminine toys. That's just me. But yet this goes to the idea of gender nonconformity. Team Addison and Ethan might say, well, those are signs that the child may have a different gender. Whereas a sane person might say, why can't a boy like girly toys and still be a boy? We should let that child be and maybe sit with this for a while, let them kind of learn a little bit, grow up a little bit, see if they're okay being a girly boy. See if this causes them any issues. See if issues persist or develop. And, you know, one might say, well, they're only being treated differently because you let them play with the girly toys. That's not a concern, okay? Because if they're attracted to those toys, there's something in them inherently, in their personality, okay? So you have to let them grow into that, whether that means that they've inherited female characteristics in their brain that will make them feel dysphoric in their male body, or whether they've just they just have an interest in these characteristically feminine things and yet still okay with their male gender. It's all okay. But we shouldn't be introducing the concept to young children that maybe this means he isn't even a boy. Because a child is just going to trust that suggestion in many cases, and that could lead to false positives, right? That might implant something that's not inherent in that child's personality. Now, it's true. Gendered behaviors exist. Babies and children, even in apes, that have no socialization, no social constructs. It's all pure biology. Even the apes show gendered interests. Boys like objects, while girls are more interested in people and animals, right? This is why typically trucks and weapons and kind of engineering type things are marketed to boys, while dolls and animal toys are and social toys are marketed to girls. But obviously there's a spectrum between, and deviation and crossover. This doesn't change your gender though, right? These are just tendencies, and it could lead to dysphoria because there is a huge correlation. But a gender is a accumulation of many traits. I would say primarily physical, especially in social communication. Sometimes the internal interests will direct someone to want to outwardly reflect that certain correlative body type, right?
That's a question I would like to throw out to other members of the panel, actually, because just like the 4-year-old can't answer what is a girl, well, this is one of the problems with this left-wing gender ideology, is that no one who espouses it can even tell you what these words mean. It's like, what is a woman?
Well,
can you tell me what a woman is?
No, I can't.
I mean, been saying it for a long time, but this is a brilliant tactic. Absolutely devastating. And Matt Walsh deserves credit for putting this center stage. This is why this moment is why this whole debate went viral. This is the first time this type of argument has been put on the national stage. This is an absolute, utter, total destruction of Ethan and Addison's entire philosophy. They're talking about something that they can't define. Imagine that. Using a word that you don't even know what it means, and that you admit that it doesn't mean anything. That it's an empty label, and yet you're talking about it. You're making argument. You're going on TV to talk about these things, and you don't even know what the word means. And they admit it. They're proud of it. It's the crux of their entire fundamentalist ideology. Imagine if I gave lectures and tours and wrote books about a super important grunkelstonk, and someone asked me to define what a grunkelstonk is, and I said, I can't. The absurdity. Now, Matt Walsh is not the first to do this. This has been my problem with gender activists for a long time. But this is the big public moment. The first time the public has ever heard this question put so succinctly, and he just hit it out of the park with this one.
Because it's not for me to say. Womanhood looks different for everybody.
Okay. This is a very typical line for their position, and while literally true, what they actually mean by this is that you can't define woman. That's what it means. Yes, one woman may feel like a woman with super glam, high fashion. The other may feel womanhood through motherhood, while the other woman may be sporty and competitive. Another might be black leather, shaved hair, spiky jewelry. The other might be Marilyn Monroe. Women are different. They feel womanly doing different things. But what Vincent, I don't know why I keep calling him Vincent, Ethan, right? And his compatriots mean by this is anything can be identified as a woman, as long as that person self-identifies using that label, which is not how language works at all. This is even worse than the bastardization of pronouns. This is like undercutting the very concept of words itself. So they might not be aware that this is what they actually mean by womanhood looks different for everybody. But this is what those words mean. If it looks different for everybody, what that means is that the label doesn't have any common traits across the people who are put under that label. It can't mean anything else. Here's a twist on the old stock attack helicopter joke identity. What if by I identify as an attack helicopter, what I'm really describing is that I think I like to dress in pink all day, every day, and I simply use the label attack helicopter to describe my pink fetish, even though the word helicopter and attack have nothing to do with me wearing pink. That's the label I use. Attack helicopter looks different in expression for everybody, even though those words already have meaning outside of this context. This is what's happening here. They want anyone to be able to redefine words that already have widespread usage, and they want to be able to do it at the drop of a hat, and have everyone else who doesn't agree to be guilted into misusing that term similarly, lest you offend them, lest you be a bigot, lest you get canceled. So, or ruin the party. So this is why I cannot get on board with this stuff. If you can't define a word that you're using in any context, if it can mean anything, then it means nothing. And thus all of your arguments mean nothing, because your premise means nothing. And thus no conclusion can be drawn from it. They just want the label, which is odd, because if the label can mean anything, why do you care what label you use? Why? Why can't their birth pronouns just be whatever identity they have come to have for themselves? Why not just use the label you were quote-unquote assigned at birth to mean whatever you express it to mean? Why can't Addison just be expressing masculinity in Addison's special particular way? What's the point of changing labels when that label can mean anything? Because then you don't have to change it, because it can just mean whatever you want the new label to mean. The reason is because they want the aesthetic of that label, because they want the baggage associated with that label, but they want the ability to deconstruct its meaning whenever convenient. So, Ethan wants to use male he him pronouns because it has the baggage associated with it, masculinity and maleness, and thus why he has that masculine look as well. And Addison denies male or female pronouns because Addison doesn't want to be associated with the masculine or the feminine, or wants to be associated with both. So it's this Schrodinger's, it's simultaneously denying and accepting the rigid gender stereotypes. It's this strange contradiction that's so hard to put into words, because in one sense they want to be able to strip it of meaning, but in that case it wouldn't matter what label they use, but they want to use specific labels because of the cultural significance it has. It's just bizarre.
What do you define a woman as?
An adult human female.
And what does a female mean?
Okay, so do you remember when Addison already stated what female means, that it's biological sex? Addison described it as what's between your legs. So Addison's just playing games at this point, and it's not being honest. This is a deflection tactic because the game is lost at this point. And I will say, I do think Matt Walsh is a little off here. I would use the definition of woman as an adult with primarily female secondary sex characteristics. Of course, not counting injuries, because you can lose those characteristics and not be able to gain them back. Yeah.
Well, that's
how do you define a
someone with female reproductive organs.
Okay.
Someone who's, here's the thing: when you're female, it goes right down to your bones, your DNA. So that
not strictly true, but I'll explain in a minute.
That's why if someone dies, we could dig up their bones 100 years from now. We have no idea what they believed in their head, but we can tell what sex they were because it's ingrained in every fiber of their being.
Every fiber of their being? This is quite a wishy-washy, stupid, spiritual, essentialist term. It's not biologically true at all, not even in the strictest sense. So yes, there are anatomical features associated with sex and gender, but not all. Okay, so they're not even necessarily in the DNA. There are typical correlations, right? But okay, so would Matt Walsh accept gender transition if we could actually replace the Y chromosome in each cell with an X? It's not totally implausible. What about, would he accept it if we could change the entire skeleton and muscle structure? Would he accept gender transition if we could literally transplant male brains into, or born male brains into female bodies? No, of course not. He's just creeped out by the idea of some chick who used to be a man. That's it. It's not the way God created them, in his view. So this is why he can never be fully correct, because his fundamental premise is false, just like Addison and Ethan. So nature has shown the proclivity to make fish and frogs who can switch functional sex. The concept is not inherent to a person, it is biological.
I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
And the biological can change while the person in their mind stays the same.
Interesting. So I'm trying to understand. Your definition is that a woman is someone who is female, you said, right?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Is a biological female.
So what happens if we have maybe someone who is female, identifies as a woman, right? You know, cisgender woman, right? As you just explained, but maybe doesn't have the ability to reproduce. Maybe doesn't have those organs that you're talking about that are reproductive organs.
I have answered the question.
Okay, so Matt dodges here. Straight up. But to be fair, only because Addison is dodging. But Addison does bring up a good point. We still consider people with genetic sterility as one sex or the other. Or injuries, as I mentioned previously. Matt's conception of sex and gender is not capable of addressing this. He thinks of it in essential terms instead of biological terms or in proximal terms. There are genetic conditions which leave an XX female infertile. She may even lack reproductive organs. So Matt's definition falls apart now. My definition holds because she's still most proximal to the biological standard of a reproductive female. So that still works. And take, for example, androgen insensitivity syndrome or other similar syndromes. These women and men are born with a variety of mutations, but they're all genetically quote-unquote male, aka XY chromosomes, and yet these are not male chromosomes. This is what people who don't understand biology don't get. That's not how biochemistry works, okay? You don't get a Y and all of a sudden you're just essentially male. It's the hormones, the proteins that are translated from the chromosomes and how they're regulated that matter and that create the phenotype. You may have so XY is a simplified version of a genotype, but you might have a Y chromosome that's functionally an X chromosome in most ways because it just isn't working as a typical Y would, and so you get an X phenotype. If the Y chromosome malfunctions in some way, it might create a female body because it's not contributing the genetic material that turns the female fetus into a male. Female is the default growth, a cycle development in a human until testosterone and other hormones are introduced, where the labia, the clitoris, and the ovaries change shape and location into penis and testicles and scrotum. So if that doesn't kick on from the Y chromosome, you're not going to get those changes into male genitalia, and yet you're still going to have remnants of what looks like a Y chromosome, but you're going to get female anatomy.
I'm Imogen. I have complete androgen insensitivity syndrome.
Today we're going to be talking about androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS. More specifically, we'll be talking about complete androgen insensitivity syndrome, CAIS. Now, I'm not a doctor nor a scientist, and I don't represent all intersex people, but I am going to be talking about my experience being androgen insensitive.
Activists take the fact that intersex conditions exist and they deconstruct it to the point where now gender means nothing anymore. Just because genetics does not necessarily determine gender in all cases does not mean that new genders should be invented, and does not mean that gender can be determined simply by identifying with a certain label. And what do conservatives like Matt Walsh do with this kind of information? These are genetic males who are clearly female. Some of them can even give birth. So Matt Walsh's conception of gender is still fucked. Because if it's based on genetics, Matt Walsh-type conservatives will have to admit that a man can indeed be pregnant and give birth. Otherwise, they have to concede that genetic males can be women. It's all about the physical structures, the phenotype, and those can be manipulated post-birth, medically or naturally. Matt Walsh doesn't understand the first thing about this. So, this is why science education is very important. This is why my concept is scientifically educated, and the concept of no one on this stage right now is scientifically educated. None of theirs are scientifically educated. Mine is. So women with androgen insensitivity syndrome are insensitive to androgens, go figure, and thus their body never transforms into a male body, even though they don't have two X chromosomes. So would Matt call these women with female sex organs, albeit highly infertile, would he call them men just because they have a defective Y chromosome that creates a woman body from birth? It's something he would never be able to know without a laboratory and a team of scientists to gene test them. What about XXY chromosomes? Surely that would be a third gender genotype, right? No. So, I don't know actually what he would say to the XY females that are born female, a lot of whom don't know, have no idea that they have XY chromosomes. They go through puberty and they were identified as female at birth. They grow up as girls, they go through puberty as girls, and a lot of them end up finding out that they have XY chromosomes when they don't get their period, because they're infertile. So they end up finding out a decade and a half later that they're not female, and yet you'd never know. So this is why our concept of gender needs to be based on the secondary sex characteristics, because you can't have women who Matt Walsh would identify as women, who all of society would identify as women, one day, because we found out they have XY chromosomes, they're not a woman anymore. That's not how it works. Because we were functionally using their gender for a long time. And then all of a sudden it changes because of a letter Y? No. That's not how it works. Only my conception, and I'm not saying I'm the only one with this conception, but only my conception out of the concepts of gender presented in this video is capable of assimilating all of the biological facts and still remaining consistent with one principle, right? So it's the proximity to the typical that defines what the category any deviation belongs to. This can include a penis in the woman category. Sorry. Gender is based on anatomy, not genetics. It's phenotype, not genotype. That's English, buddy. Get used to it. The fact that we can categorize sterile females as women means we can categorize trans women as women. But woman still means something. That's the point. Matt Walsh has the upper hand in that he actually has a definition. It doesn't work quite that well. It usually works. You know, I'll give him that. Doesn't work in all instances, which is why mine is superior. But still means something. Still means feminine in aggregate. It categorically cannot mean whoever self-identifies with that label, because it's not even possible. Like, that's not how words work. You can't even. It's not even an English language thing. It's just. You can't do that. There's no arguing with this. That's what words are. They have to have a meaning. You can't just say you're a word, say you're a label, and then get to define whatever that means later. It's But my way is just a simple and foolproof way to categorize things. It's inarguable, and unfortunately both sides of this debate tend to be wrong because they're fundamentalist religious or fundamentalist woke. But same thing. Neither has logic and facts at their core. They have an agenda at their core to either stop all the transes and enforce rigid gender roles, or allow unlimited expansion of gender into rigid gender roles so that it's meaningless. So ironically, we end up at horseshoe theory. A lot of people don't like this, but it's absolutely true in a lot of instances. The extremes on both sides end up enforcing strict gender roles because the wokesters think that you have a new gender every time you deviate from the stereotypical cis male or female. And even non-binary is not enough. And the religious Christian fundamentalists also have very strict gender roles that are basically socially constructed as well. Both are socially constructed. So it's ironic. The wokesters' problem with social construction, and yet all of their genders are social constructs. They're kind of anti-social constructs because they ignore society, but it's the same because, you know, it is still a social construct. They say personal feelings and personality can define a new gender. So they're saying minor personality differences make a new gender, and thus this actually restricts how you can express or should express according to the individual's identity, like we're seeing on stage, how they can express their gender, because otherwise you're some new gender. To be fair, they say only you get to decide you have a new gender, so they're not saying, oh, you're not stereotypical, so you must not be whatever. But they kind of are, because this mentality that they want to spread, that they have for themselves, enforces this kind of thinking that if I'm a girly man, I must not be a cis man. And if you enforce that type of thinking, other people will adopt that type of thinking, right?
You stood up here and said trans women are women.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean. What is a woman?
Womanhood is something that, just as Ethan explained, I cannot define because I am not
but
myself.
You used the word, so what did you mean when you said trans women are women if you don't know what it means?
Right?
Okay, so Addison is complaining about getting interrupted. Ethan's gonna interrupt, by the way, and that's fine. But yet another devastating blow. How can you say trans women are women if you don't know what it means? And he's right to interrupt because Addison is literally purely incoherent. How can you say you or something else is not in a category if you can't define that category? Again, these people define a category as valid if and only if you decide to label yourself in that category. It makes no sense. How is it valid just because you call yourself that? That means that I can use adjectives that way. I can just declare myself correct. And you can't deny the validity of that. I'm correct gender. Again, going back to the attack helicopter example, I'm not accusing these people of thinking you can actually become an attack helicopter by saying you are. It's even more incoherent than that. what they're proposing. What they're saying is that the category of attack helicopter, and you can't tell what an attack helicopter is unless it tells you that it is one. Attack helicopter simultaneously means a machine and a person with green hair and a person with spiky hair and metal piercings and a person, you know, it could mean anything. So it means nothing. There are no shared traits across the category. Therefore, it means nothing. The only thing that's shared by members of the category, the label. Absolutely disgusting. Oof. Just total bastardization of language. It doesn't get more incoherent than this, literally. You know, this reminds me of religious apologetics. God is God because he told me he's God. The Bible is true because the Bible says it's true. These people are more similar in their fundamentalist methods than they even realize. They just worship different gods, but their methods are exactly the same.
The thing. So I do not define what a woman is because I do not identify as a woman. Women.
Look at his face. Addison just said something so abhorrently stupid. It's just not really possible to communicate. I won't repeat myself, but this is just more examples of the true delusion. The delusion isn't that we can change sex or gender. The actual delusion is that we can't define something unless we label ourselves as that thing, in which case that thing can simultaneously mean opposite things. You want to talk about offensive? I mean, get out of town. But that's not how language works. You can define things without being it. Imagine saying you don't know what a dog is because you're not a dog. Like, actually try to wrap your mind around what this absolute insanity of a statement is saying. Use the dog example. You can't say what a dog is because you're not a dog. Like, it's this weird thing where it's like one of those objects that in like a time travel plot where it never actually existed. It just showed up one day and then the character brings it into the future to pass it on to the past where it originally came into the story, just to be brought back to the future, to go back to the past. It was never actually created. It just came out of nowhere. This is what they think a gender is. You have to define yourself as a gender and then you can decide what it is. It's like this infinite loop of insanity. Like, I can't say what a woman is because I'm not a woman. How do you even know you're not a woman if you can't say what a woman is? How do you know if you're not a woman if you don't want to know what a woman is? What is going on here? This is how Addison just absolutely exposed the vacuousness of this position. If you merely adopt a label, you now get to define what it means, but only in a local sense. Someone else might use the same label, and they get to define what it means, and it could be completely different. I could say, my pronoun, I could say woman means a giant green ogre, and that person over there could say woman means a bright red attack helicopter. And we would both be correct. You can have them say completely opposite things. These people worship labels. They are magical, transformative words, and yet they can't get over their disconnection from reality that if you use words that way, they have no meaning. This is the death of language. This is the part that pisses me off the most. This is because it's the most wrong. I cannot stress this enough. This is... I don't care what you look like, but you start fucking around with the essential function of words, well, you've crossed the line, buddy, in my opinion. And actually, not in my opinion. In fact.
Hood is something that is an umbrella term. It includes people
that describes what?
Yes, it is an umbrella term, just like almost all terms, but Matt correctly asks, what does the umbrella term describe? And
people who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
Was to eat.
Such a simple and devastating question. What is that? Identify as what? As a woman. What does that mean? This is just people are seeing that this is not this conversation. It can't take place. This is because they're speaking two different languages, and Addison isn't even speaking a language. Like, at some point, there's just no conversation that can be had because the ideas cannot physically, conceptually, metaphorically be put into words because they don't exist. And whatever sense can be made of it, they're using different words. They're using the same words differently. So even if they weren't just unprepared for actual dialogue, the conversation cannot happen. Communication is not happening here. And if you identify as a label, again, it's just an empty label. Why use an empty label? Why identify with a label unless it actually carries a meaning to it? Matt could just identify as a woman and say his body is a woman's body. What does this communicate? Absolutely nothing. If Matt Walsh's body and Scarlett Johansson's body are both women's bodies, then a woman's body means nothing. Why use the word at all? It communicates nothing, no meaning. If I just say, imagine a woman's body, you wouldn't be able to do it. Because you'd be picturing Matt Walsh and Scarlett Johansson. Well, you wouldn't be because you wouldn't know which to picture because there's no similarities. You can see Addison struggling to try and maintain the empty tautology while still making any sense.
Each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently. And so trans women are women too.
Okay. Jesus, the crowd goes wild. I know why. Because they hear the Trojan horse, to each their own. Everyone is different, which is true and feel good, but what it contains within it, in this context, is these terms are completely meaningless. Yes, everyone is going to express themselves differently, but from there, Addison leaps to everyone gets to use the same words differently. This is insidious garbage coming from this ideology. It is literally the death of language.
And you want to hold on. You want to reduce. Listen.
Even tell me what the word means, though. So
you
that's
want to
the problem.
reduce women. You want to reduce men down to maybe just their genetics.
Good on Matt for trying to keep on topic. Addison is trying to score crowd-pleasing. Be yourself. To each your own. As if that's a defeater to the fact that the problem is that they're unable to define a simple word that they're using as if it means something. They're using it as if it means something, but it actually doesn't mean anything to them. Here's a question. Why do Addison and Ethan identify as they instead of woman or man? Ethan does identify as man and they. So the label must means something so that they feel like they're not a part of that definition, yet they twist themselves into knots trying to expand the definition to self-identification, stripping the words of all meaning.
Our genitals, our chromosomes, right? That's what you're saying.
You want to do is
that's what
you want to do is appropriate women. You want to appropriate womanhood, and turn it into basically a costume that can be worn. We've got.
Hey, he kind of misses the mark here. They want labels to be costumes that can be worn. A trans woman who goes through all the things to transform her body is not wearing a costume, Matt. What you would be just talking about would be drag. Literally, drag queens appropriate femininity and wear it as a costume. Nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with cultural appropriation. There's nothing wrong with gender appropriation. It's called sharing. Try it sometime. It's, and albeit drag is exaggerated femininity in most cases, it is a celebration. Just like cultural appropriation, it's an appreciation for what you're doing. So a trans woman is not a costume. A drag queen is a costume. Trans woman, not a costume. However, the trans trenders and the gender absolutionists certainly do think femininity and masculinity and everything else they want to genderize are mere costumes, especially if you change them several times a day. But the point is, these people use language as costumes, as fashion. They're playthings to these people, especially the ones who change them a lot. It's literally fashion. And they wear them on their face. It's a signal. Not necessarily to a virtue signal, but a type of cultural signal. I'm not down with the gender stereotypes, man. Which ironically enforces the stereotypes, because you can be cisgender and not be down with the stereotypes. And you can be cisgender and not conform with the stereotypes.
When we, it's real funny. It's real funny. It's real funny when you're
should look like. Right. As a man, you're literally saying this is what a woman is.
Yeah. Well,
as a man, you're saying what a woman should look like. Isn't that a little sexist? No, it's not. Not even a little bit. It's attempting to define the word that you're using.
Isn't that a little sexist?
Because I am willing to define it.
Yeah, he's willing to define it. And did you notice Ethan there interrupts him? You're not going to hear Addison complain about Ethan interrupting Matt, but you'll hear complaints about Matt interrupting Addison. Huh.
But you won't.
Hang on. We've heard how...
Yep, he'll define it, but they won't. And even with his somewhat flawed definition, he wins hands down. No contest. Period. End of story. Done. And I have no favor for Matt Walsh. I clearly despise him. Did you notice the facial stress twitches Vincent had that whole time? You can tell Matt is getting to them.
How Matt feels about pronouns, but my next guest says those who oppose them are asking the wrong questions. What does she say are the right ones? We'll add her to the conversation when we come back. Well, we've been talking about the great gender pronoun debate that has the country divided, just almost 50-50. Last segment, Matt made his case against people using what are called their own pronouns.
And notice, there was, when Addison and Ethan were making their case, there was absolutely, Matt wasn't on stage, there was absolutely no pushback. What Phil, I'm not saying Phil's taking a side, but when Phil says Matt made his case, it was the whole time being interrupted and attacked and argued with by the other side. He didn't quite have as much of a chance to make a case, did he?
But my next guest says the opposition is taking the wrong approach. Joining us on stage is Dr. Susie Denbo, Associate Professor at Kent State University with a PhD in communications and expertise in...
That's ironic because she's going to attempt to thrust upon us words that communicate nothing. She clearly does not understand communication.
In gender, sex, and feminism. Now, Kent State has been recognized among the nation's most LGBTQ plus friendly universities. Now, doctors, thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.
You've been listening to everything that we've been talking about. So, Dr. Denbo, how do you feel those who oppose using pronouns are taking the wrong approach in this conversation?
I think there's the extreme approach that you are admittedly taking.
Admittedly, he didn't admit that. And that's not extreme unless you already consider the gender extremist activists to be the nationwide cultural norm, which it is not. But these elitists already consider themselves the leaders and the default and the correct ones shining from atop the hill.
And then there's also just ordinary people that might not be comfortable with the language change. And I think there's the extreme approach that you are admittedly taking. And then there's also...
Even though they're the ones bastardizing language, and I love his face here.
So just ordinary people that might not be comfortable with the language change. And it just is awkward. And so they're afraid of not being...
Yes, it is awkward. Very awkward.
Being courteous or being accepting. So there's like these two things. There's actually combating and not being... You don't like transgender, the idea of transgender. That's different than pronouns. But then just for most people, it's just feeling a little bit awkward and unsure and not wanting to hurt or offend somebody.
Wow, what a dichotomy. Matt does just not like transgender people. That is true. But this dichotomy, either you just hate trans people or you're on our side and you just don't quite know how to submit yet. This is religious fundamentalism if I've ever seen it. No, most people are like me. They think trans people are fine and valid, but they don't want people to use language as a weapon to silence and destroy it and corrupt the concept of gender and language itself that works for most people.
Well, why is it important for educators to teach about gender identity, gender presentation, and pronouns? Why do you think that's important?
Because there is a difference. There is biological sex, and a lot of times people are conflating sex and gender. So there's biological sex, and then there's gender, and that's a social construct. In this,
to these people, social construct means it can be whatever we want it to be. It's just... So they want to have a different social construct, but they think the current social construct is oppressive. So, but they don't really understand what social constructs are because they just think that means they can change it. But it's a lot deeper than that. So, war and peace are social constructs. Government is a social construct. The title of doctor is a social construct. Gender is a social construct, but is bounded by biology and anatomy, since it's based on sex. And all of these things are also bounded by physical facts. Right? War and peace are bounded by the physical fact of conflict or no conflict. Government is backed by the physical facts of its structure and the actions people will take in the institutions. Title of doctor is certainly backed by the physical facts of at least the knowledge in someone's brain. But there are social constructs surrounding all of these things. Who cares? Social construct is nothing but a buzzword for these people that means we can change it to whatever we want.
in the sense that Just because you're born biologically a female doesn't mean you automatically want to vacuum, for instance, which is usually a feminine activity. Or
what? I mean, I get the point she's making, but come on. No one likes vacuuming. It is not a feminine trait to vacuum. I know a lot of people who vacuuming is the guy's chore.
Conflated that way. And so it's this idea of giving children in age-appropriate ways an understanding that that these things aren't set in stone. Gender identity is not tied to biology.
You said,
well, it is, but when is it age appropriate? Because adults are confused by this. So why the hell are we trying to teach young children about this? Especially when most of them are going to be perfectly healthy, developing normally. You're more likely to negatively affect huge percentages of children by implanting these suggestions in their minds that gender is something else, than we are to harm the tiny, tiny percentage of children who do have legitimate inborn gender issues and dysphoria. So I think some kind of flexibility should be introduced to kids. I don't think we should keep the idea of trans people away from kids. If they notice or ask, I don't think drag queens are inappropriate for kids, as long as it's not like hypersexual. I don't think kids doing drag is inappropriate. It's okay to play with gender as a kid. It's definitely appropriate to teach your kids that it's okay to play with any toy they want, to look how they want to look, to play with gender. In fact, the kids do play with gender. That's how they learn. It's okay to teach your kid that just because a boy might like dolls doesn't make him not a boy. That just because a girl likes frogs and mud and sports doesn't mean she is a boy. And we should teach kids that that's okay for people to like those things. In the context that other children will try to enforce strict gendered roles on each other, that's fucked up, and we can raise children to be more open to this. But if you start telling your children that you can switch your gender, not just teach them about people who have done this, but tell them that they can switch their gender, the child's gender, you get into problems. Now you're planting ideas in their heads. Now you're opening the door to any behavior and identity. A kid hears that and they hear that and they think, why can't I be a dinosaur? A kid hears that and thinks, maybe I should change my gender. Maybe it's cool to change my gender. These aren't the questions of just which pastimes they engage in. It's how they fundamentally conceive of themselves as beings.
Say that gender's not set in stone.
It's not.
What do you mean?
I mean that's just factually incorrect, saying that. So you have...
Yeah, it's not set in stone. Okay. So what?
Biology is the chromosomal makeup and reproductive organs and all of that. And so that would be sort of the nature side of things. But the nurture...
And she ignores phenotype, even though that's biology. Possibly the most important part of biology.
Side of things is where we see more of gender identities.
She began by saying that my view is extreme. Okay, so the view that every single person on Earth has held up until 15 seconds ago is extreme. And the view that almost everyone does right now still hold is extreme, apparently, according to her. But there is this they are conflated.
Your side is literally incoherent and cannot define a basic word. That one of the most basic words in the language, and she's laughing at him for not making sense. This is what cognitive dissonance looks like. This Dr. Susie is the avatar for it.
Gender and sex, because on one hand they say, well, you got your biological sex, but then your gender is whatever social construct. But then they turn around and say that trans women are women. So a man who identifies with the gender, the social construct of womanhood, actually is a woman. So if you can...
a great point. What is it that Ethan here is identifying with? He said he identifies with male pronouns. Why? Because he wants to look like and be treated like the social construct of man. And he changed his body from female at birth to what we see now, because this social construct of man is inherently tied to anatomy. If they actually practiced what they preached, Ethan would either still be going by she/her pronouns and just looking this way and saying this is just how she expresses womanhood, or just change his pronouns to male and not change the body and say this is how he expresses his masculinity. But no, for some reason that they'll never be able to articulate, Vincent changes both. Almost like he knows gender is tied to anatomy and pronoun is tied to anatomy. So why is he so clearly following the gender binary social construct of masculinity? Because what are trans people even doing when they transition? Why would a trans woman feel dysphoric if gendered male? What is it exactly that they were born wrong into? The wrong body. But if non-binary theory of gender were true, a trans woman could just declare their masculine visage to be their version of woman, and so it would be. If their theory of gender were true, that would erase trans people from existence. Not Matt Walsh. Certainly not my version, but the Addison and Ethan's gender theory does erase trans people. The entire concept of gender dysphoria would be someone clinging to social construct stereotype of gender that doesn't actually exist. But that's not true. Gender dysphoria is biologically based. The gender of the mind does not match the gender of the body. This isn't possible if Addison and Vincent's ideology is true. It's to some extent Matt Walsh's, but not quite the same egregiousness, because Matt's closer, technically, because he has a definition. So they've just called all of gender dysphoria a social construct and, by extension, non-existent, because that's what social construct means to them. So when it comes to any particular pronoun, like Ethan's male pronouns, why are you using that word? You must have something on your mind as to what it is if you want to use that word. Why that word? What meaning does it have for you? It's not just picked randomly. It's picked for a reason. Come on. If you can't communicate it, there's no reason for you to have that label, so it must have an inherent meaning, or else you could just imbue your birth pronouns with the meaning that you want. But no, it carries that baggage that I was talking about earlier. So it carries the masculine baggage. Either Ethan wants to look like the pronoun that he picked, or he wants the pronoun to match what he looks like, and because they're tied. So why can't you just be a man or a woman who doesn't fall into a stereotype? Because they know that man and woman do mean something, and that at some point they cross that line. That's why Ethan has a male pronoun and a male look. It's not just a coincidence. So at this point, how do you know who's actually a woman and who's just saying they are? There's no way to know with their ideology, because I could just declare it and it's so. Ridiculous. Claiming that gender isn't limited to a binary is a claim that gender as a concept is non-binary, which in fact does define the majority of identities who are binary, even trans folks, out of existence. even if you say they get to self-identify, that still doesn't work, since their identity is not based on self-identification. It's based on physical fact. I'm all for being inclusive and welcoming, but this woke stuff is inherently exclusive in the name of including the tiny minority. Matt Walsh absolutely devastates them with this point, and it goes 1,500 light years over their heads. This is the contradiction, the irony I've been trying to point out. They want to have their cake and eat it too by explicitly denying that gender has any inherent meaning or form, and yet they change their bodies and change their pronouns as if these pronouns or these bodies do have some kind of inherent baggage, some kind of inherent cultural meaning. Why doesn't Addison just say they're a man? A pretty man with long hair and a femme voice who wears dresses. Or a bearded woman. Why isn't that expression of maleness or masculinity or femininity enough for Addison? Why does Addison feel they need to change into a non-binary? Because Addison is being gender non-conforming, and thus Addison thinks that they have a different gender, that they don't fit into the normal genders because they're not being stereotypically male or female. Addison is still dealing with the implications behind male and female pronouns, the social and biological constructs behind it. Addison doesn't identify with the stereotype of a man, and so leaves that gender entirely. There's actually nothing unnatural about a long-haired, well-groomed, bearded man, even in an open dress. In fact, dresses make a lot more sense on the male genitalia than female, in my opinion. Not the cleavage part, but the open bottom part. Pants fit vaginas better, and open skirts and dresses fit penises better. Just my opinion. Just kind of a biological, geometrical fact. Listen, guys, you probably know this by now. I am not a gender conformist. I am 100% for the destruction of gender role stereotypes and gender behavioral stereotypes, etc. Being a domestic housekeeper or a breadwinner, there's no reason to enforce a gender expectation on these roles in society. Just like there's no expectation of enforcing a specific role on a two-spirit androgynous person. Those are oppressive and stifling. But that's the point. Being a sensitive boy who likes to play with dolls does not make one a trans girl. Being a tomboy does not make a little girl into a trans boy. And not conforming to the typical traits does not make one have both genders or no gender or bug gender or any new gender. Non-binary people and gender abolitionists inherently attack this idea that gender is not a fixed stereotype. These people ironically enforce gender stereotypes, that because I call someone a man, that means I have defined their personality and their history somehow, or that someone doesn't feel like a stereotypical man, therefore he isn't one. But if your gender label means whatever you want it to mean, what's the problem with Addison identifying male? Because Addison still holds on to the rigid, stereotypical gender roles, even while expressing opposition to them. This is the contradiction.
You can laugh all you want, but this is a logical problem. You are conflating sex and gender just by saying that. So that's the problem.
There's biological sex, and then there is gender identity. Part of me wants to ask why you care so much, because it's really not that big of a deal.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, attacking motivation. Listen, I have not been shy about accusing Matt. Okay, but this is, oh my God. Just...
Answer that? I'd love to answer that question. I care about the truth. So basic truth matters. I want to live in a society where people care about the truth and we're grounded in truth.
Yeah, that's the point. This question, why do you care so much? Questioning one's motives Hey, I engage in pathologizing people's motives all the time. I did it several times to Matt in this. But the point in me bringing that up, personally, is to kind of point out how I disagree with him as a person, but I agree with his arguments. So I'm not like, it's to point out that I'm not being tribalistic, right? I don't like Matt as a person, and yet I agree with his arguments because I don't have a side, like a tribal side, where I always have to oppose everything the conservatives and the religious advocate for because I'm an atheist and I'm a liberal, so I have to do that. No. That's the point of me bringing it up. I don't let it distract from truth claims, though, like this woman does. She uses it as a dismissive tactic. I never do that. I never say, well, your motivations are da-da-da-da, therefore I don't have to listen to your argument. In fact, I'm saying your motivations are quite opposite from truth and reality, and yet I can recognize when you are making a true claim. Complete opposite of what Dr. Susie is doing. So I don't use it as a cudgel to throw a red herring out and distract. Matt Walsh obviously cares because he thinks it's icky. Yes. But what he's saying is correct. Largely. And this question is also frequently asked about the trans athletes. Why do you even care about women's high school swimming? You only care because you hate the transes. See, it's used to distract and avoid and dodge.
Why it's that big of an issue unless you think, and I think a lot of people should be more honest about this. They just think trans women are icky and weird and gross.
I don't. I have a trans
and that's
friend.
where they're like, that's where a lot of it comes from.
I don't at all. If that's
where
how you
people
want to live, love you, we can be friends, all of it.
But like,
so no.
But why else would you give a shit over? Like,
yeah.
Because
did you pay attention to swimming
and
before?
testosterone have advantages.
Have you ever cared about like who the best swimmer is?
Do you know who the second? Do you know who the second? Yeah. Do you know who
Hand
the
out
swim
to
time
me.
of the nation is?
Is it a woman?
Do you know?
No, I have no idea.
Yeah. Why don't you know?
Because I don't care. Because I don't care.
Exactly. You only care about this because there's a trans woman.
No, it's because men have a competitive advantage over women. Athletically.
No, you're literally proving my point. That's people only act like they give a shit about this issue because trans people. Okay, that's it. They don't want trans people competing, and that's precisely why.
Let's make a trans league. Why not make a trans league?
Because there would be 3 people across like every fucking sport. That would be insane.
Okay, and if there's no difference, why can't the trans women compete with the men?
What?
Why can't the trans women compete with the men?
Because that would also be insane. Because if there's
their feelings.
They've done that and people complain. They've like literally done that.
I know. So there was one wrestler who that he was gonna wrestle a woman. Never mind. I don't know. I'm against it. End of discussion. And
also because they're not men. That's a trans woman. That's not a trans man. Trans men can compete with
so if I am a woman tomorrow, I should be able to compete with the women.
I can't speak on like people who are not like in the process of gender confirmation. Like I know that if someone says they're a trans woman, like my immediate inclination isn't to say, oh, that person is probably lying for attention or anything like that. But as far as like competitive rules goes, one, I personally don't care. If someone is like, I'm a trans woman and I want to compete against cis women.
This is why gender activists don't see a problem with trans athletes having an advantage in women's sports. For them, it's not about this being a symptom of a larger society that's been demoralized and no longer knows what values create fairness. It's about labels, and that's it. It's about controlling the language and thus the way people think. In this case, they want to stop people from thinking trans people are icky. They think the category of woman only exists as a label and does not exist to describe physical differences. So the physical difference, which they acknowledge, is simply irrelevant to the category of men and women.
Like, some people have done that, and 99% of those people are conservative commentators that try to fucking get like try to do a quick own to make a point that, like, you know, men are stronger than women or whatever by average. And that's true. Like, that is literally true. And it's always
So
like
if that's true,
that dude Zubies or whatever, that's like the dog shit rapper. He did that where he was like, oh, I won a weightlifting competition. But that's fake. And you're the guy who did that. There's no other instance where, like,
But if you just said that men are on average typically stronger than women, then simply because someone labels themselves as a woman, you say, oh, well then they're a woman and they should be able to compete with the women. Like, I don't understand.
Talk to me when there is
this is
someone. Talk to me when there is someone who's not a conservative commentator, who's not clearly doing this for funsies.
But
no.
That's...
But that's a trans woman. That's not like. Do you think that person is faking it to win?
No, but I do think he has an athletic, or she has an athletic advantage for sure.
So what?
So for them, it's not about the actual physical unfairness in reality. It's about the intentions in someone's heart that matters to the leftoids. They see physical differences among cis women, like height and strength, as no different from the physical advantages in trans women, even though there is a clear correlation between ability ranges in one sex versus the other with little overlap. They don't care about the fairness of an institution. They just think unless you actually care about the individual athletes, only the words you use matter and not the actual reality of what values a society needs to apply in order to be fair and rational.
Talk to me when someone is not. Talk to me when there's someone who's like faking being trans to win a fucking competition. Okay. That's like, nobody cares about these sports. People just care about it because there's trans people competing.
We do.
No, you don't. You don't care. You don't know who the second fastest
Because I don't
is.
pay attention to swimming until a man is competing with the women.
Okay, but you just admitted it. You don't care. So why the fuck do you care? You only care about the trans people competing in it. You don't care about the actual sport. If you care about the integrity of the sport, then you would know who the second fastest swimmer is in the women competition.
It's an odd conundrum. Sports really aren't fair. You literally cannot be in the NBA if you're short, and you can't really play any sport if you're not physically fit. It isn't through merit that tall people dominate the sport of basketball. It's pure luck of birth, but there is still a fact that women on average are shorter and weaker. That has a real effect on the integrity of competitive games. There comes a point where the potential for advantage becomes too likely and too much to have any integrity. Yes, trans women are women, but it does depend on how far into transition the athlete is, how much the advantage is, and there are cis women who aren't allowed to compete if they have elevated levels of testosterone, even if it's natural, because at that point it's indistinguishable from the level required for it to be cheating. This is about a society that defines fairness based on truth versus a society that defines fairness based on feelings and controlling people's thoughts.
You don't care about the integrity of that process at all. No one does. It's really fucking creepy.
I just care about women having the same opportunities as men to succeed.
Okay.
They should be able to do that without men taking over their sport.
Yeah, if that quite literally was the case, then people would be advocating for every other facet where women are competing in sports. They don't give a shit about how much women get paid. As a matter of fact, they fucking cry.
Because if people don't want to watch that sport as much as they want to watch the men competing in that sport, they should not get paid if they're not producing the same amount of ratings.
Okay, so you don't care about the women's sport.
No, I care about women's sports and their opportunity to compete in the sport.
You care about women's sports as far as like trans women are competing.
I care about women's sports as far as women being able to compete fairly versus them getting paid the same amount. You get paid based on the ratings you bring in. If women were bringing in higher ratings like they do in gymnastics, female gymnasts get paid more than male gymnasts.
By the way, notice how no one cares about trans men competing with cis men because they can't. Because there is an actual difference in physical ability. This doesn't mean trans women are not women and trans men are not men. This just means that there are some differences, just like medically there are relevant health differences, based on how they became the gender that they are. And that's fine. So people like Hassan and like Dr. Susie are using this questioning motivation as a way to say, well, you don't have an argument to make because you just don't like them. And I'm not going to address your actual arguments because you're just a bigot. So any of your arguments are inherently bigoted. No, a lot of people talking about these issues simply care about a sane society that produces fair institutions. These little issues with women's sports are symptoms of a society that has lost its moral and logical compass as a whole. I don't care about high school women's sports or sports at all. What I care about is the essential values of the society that produces unfair or fair institutions, including but not limited to sports. So looking at what's happening in sports is just a symptom of broken values. It's not that we care about the sports, it's that we care about the cause of what's leading to the situation in sports. So I think this is what Matt Walsh is getting at with his I care about truth comments. Alright, I'm going to skip around a little because this is turning into an epic novel, and I'm trying to wrap this up here.
Truth. I care about children, and these insane ideas about gender are being foisted on kids, and that bothers me quite a bit. I care about the women who are having their opportunities stolen from them. I care quite a bit, yeah.
You are a champion for women. I'm more interested in creating a...
Wow. Just this sarcasm. She can't even define what a woman is. So, what is she talking about?
Productive space where we can try to build some kind of an acceptance around other people, and exposing children to different ideas around gender identity, I don't think is a problematic thing with parents being involved.
My next guest are parents who...
Yeah, so Dr. Susie wants to make this, oh, you're such a champion for women. And yet she's the one who's standing with the people who literally want to erase the meaning of what woman is.
Say, no way should children learn about gender pronouns at an early age. Not under their watch. They say if this is going to happen, it's the parents' job, not teachers. One pulled her kids out of school. We'll meet them after the break.
The entire gender pronoun situation makes me feel very upset.
I don't want a teacher talking to my child about gender pronouns. It is not appropriate. It's crossing a line.
I feel like I'm ambushed because now I'm explaining to my son. He asked me, what does sexist mean? As a parent, I felt trapped.
I had to pull both of my kids out of this school district.
A Loudoun County Public Schools teacher is suing the district. Tanner Cross is on administrative leave. He said he would not call a student who's transgender by their preferred pronoun.
And I will not affirm that a biological boy can be a girl and vice versa because it's against my religion, it's lying to a child, it's abuse to a child.
Cross was placed on pay.
Yeah, so against his religion, see? This is the motivation. And I don't bring up the motivation to say you're wrong. And I don't have to address your arguments. It's to point out, you know, as I explained earlier, but it's also to point out that if you start with a fundamental flawed premise, you're going to end up with being off track. And so I'll actually track exactly how this religious premise becomes a false conclusion. But this is the arguments. I'm not saying you're a bigot, so you must be wrong.
Paid leave. Now he's suing the district.
Well, you just saw a news clip about a teacher in Virginia who was suspended after opposing the school's gender policy. Now, inclusion in schools is a major topic of conversation because parents and administrators, well, they just don't always see eye to eye. My next guests are two concerned parents with kids the same age. Now, they used to be in the same school district until one mom pulled her children out. So while they didn't know each other before, they have unified for the same cause.
I'm really concerned about what's going on in schoolrooms across the country.
The entire gender pronoun situation makes me feel very upset.
People may think that if you don't want to use the preferred pronouns, that you're against gay people. This is 100% untrue. I am a huge advocate for gay people, trans people, and the like.
Stacy and I both have children in the same school district.
I learned that the teachers in my children's school were asking for the kids' preferred pronouns in the classroom. When I heard about this, it was extremely upsetting.
Last year, my son was given a homework assignment. I gave an example of a child not identifying with the gender that they're born with. Is an example of a homework that was given to my 8-year-old son. If a student is unsure of their place in the gender spectrum, or is experimenting with different forms of gender presentation, school uniforms can present a real challenge.
Oh my gosh. What is gender spectrum?
That's a great question. My son was really confused. I feel like I'm ambushed because now I'm explaining to my son. He asked me, what does sexist mean? As a parent, I felt trapped. I felt I had to explain these concepts to my son. I felt like I was whittling away his innocence. This year, my 12-year-old daughter had a science teacher ask the class about their preferred gender pronouns.
I don't want a teacher talking to my child about gender pronouns. It is not appropriate. It's crossing a line. It's unacceptable. This is a parent-child issue, not a teacher-child issue.
I wanted my kids to have nothing to do with it. I had to pull both of my kids out of this school district.
I've decided not to pull my children out of the school district, but I'm fighting for change. I've been attending school board meetings for about a year now. What's happening across the country is teachers could get fired if they use the wrong gender pronoun. That just seems wrong.
This is my mission in life, to protect my children, and however I need to do that, I will.
What Matt and I and a group of us are doing is we're working to have the school board removed completely. A lot of people I know, a lot of parents I know, are afraid to speak up, and I speak for them, and I'm not afraid.
Stacy, Matt, why do y'all have an issue with the schools telling children about pronouns and having them deal with them?
First of all, thank you for having me. And I wanted to say I honor you and your journey and where you are in life. And it has nothing to do with that. We're here about our kids. And so in school, I feel like this is a family issue. It's a parent-child issue, and it's a real issue with some kids. I think that the percentage is quite small for how many kids go through this real serious issue, and including and imposing this on the entire school or the entire class is where I have a problem.
There's no reason.
Yes. As Dr. Susie said earlier, we do want a space where we include people and have tolerance. On the flip side, this woman is right to say we have to balance this with the need of the majority. We cannot design policy that could affect the majority for the benefit of a tiny minority who need extra special accommodations, right? So adding a handicap accessible ramp is not going to fuck up the stairs that everyone else uses, right? So, but if we start teaching this to young kids, it's going to confuse all of the kids. Even though a tiny minority of them might need special care, and we're not really able to identify which ones really do at that age, it needs a little bit more time to mature. So, of course, we need to be open to care for and accommodate these people. And we have to have room for that, but there's a balance that needs to be struck because you can't affect negatively everyone else.
An 8-year-old should be taking an assignment that says, what is the gender about gender spectrum? And I had to explain to my 8-year-old son that they're about the gender spectrum and no longer about boys and girls, about femininity, feminine clothes.
Well, I just noticed he has a yarmulke on. I sincerely hope that he takes this principle seriously and is not teaching his young children all these stupid and complex ideas about God and religion when he doesn't want the gender complex religion to be taught to his children.
That uniforms could be sexist.
Well, let's look at your...
Yeah, that's a lot for someone who's just stopped eating boogers. I don't think we realize how dumb, like, 8-year-olds really are. I work with kids, and I started working with 8-year-olds, and not to insult them, but they're kind of dumb. They're They can be surprisingly intelligent and insightful, yes. But they're developing humans. They don't really get nuance. Not for the most part at that age. Complex ideas are not for them.
8-year-old's homework assignment. It says uniforms may be sexist. Some uniforms may strike students and parents as sexist. For example, if a uniform requires girls to wear skirts and pants are not allowed, some students and parents may object, leading to conflict with the school's administration. Not all girls want to wear skirts, and some may resent being told to wear traditionally feminine garments. Also, if a student is unsure of their place on the gender spectrum or is experimenting with different forms of gender presentation, school uniforms can present a real challenge. Now,
yes, I completely agree with this statement. I'm 100% anti-uniform for a variety of reasons, including sexist ones. But this should be a discussion that's happening with the adults, the staff, and the parents, or as an exercise with a mock debate with older, middle, high school age kids. Not put upon 8-year-olds who are still learning what freaking clouds are. 8-year-olds don't need to learn how to debate.
What was the assignment?
The assignment was whether school uniforms, pro or con, should schools have uniforms? And I believe they had that assignment just so they could squeeze this in. This was an agenda and not appropriate for 8-year-old children. When I drop my child off at school, I don't expect him to be indoctrinated. Why are we doing this? Shouldn't the schools be focused on science and education and learning and reading and writing? And instead they're being taught, are you a boy? Are you a girl? And they're confusing the children.
Yes, and I hope you aren't indoctrinating your children with religious beliefs. But you're absolutely right. Absolutely right. This is about an agenda. It is not appropriate for kids, just on the level of intellectual ability and experience that they have, let alone how impressionable they are. So, I mean, I think I'm just going to end it there, because I've probably repeated myself 100 times. This is extremely long. If you've made it this far, wow, congrats, thanks. So, they go on to talk about gender-neutral bathrooms, etc., etc. My view on this is, it was always weird that we have gendered bathrooms. And if I'm more comfortable shitting next to someone who has my same genitalia, I mean, that's just weird, because I'm not. And as if that's somehow rational, and as if male predators don't go after male children, etc. You know, you're not going to save the children because you put the male predators in the male bathrooms. Okay? I think if you put in the work to pass reasonably well as a trans person, you should have no problems using the bathroom. We can solve any other issues by having single-use bathrooms that's gender neutral, or transform all bathrooms into individual private stalls. No problems whatsoever with having neutral bathrooms. Might be a little bit more expensive. I think the schools can afford this. And this is the environment where other children will know who is trans and who's not. Unlike in public, if you pass reasonably, you'll not be questioned by random people using the bathroom. The other thing is, do you really want people like Blair White using men's bathroom? Do you really want people like Ethan using the women's bathrooms? No, you don't. And you're not going to know either. You're not going to have someone checking their genitals. So there's going to be people who pass who are going to be using it anyway, and you'll never know. So the fundamentalist conservatives need to grow up a little bit, and the gender activists just might be a total lost cause because they're not even speaking languages anymore. It's a religion. It makes them feel like how people feel about Jesus. So they won't give it up. All we can do is resist these overcorrections and let the fad fade, and hopefully we come to a more balanced culture. The physical and the behavioral differences will never go away. Of course, behavior is always more flexible. I'm referring to the general trends. The likelihood that girls will like dolls and boys will like trucks will always be high. And there's a biological reason for this. Evolutionary psychology. We even see this preference in monkeys. I'm not talking about pink being culturally associated with girls. The things I'm talking about are more inherent to biology. There is a correlation, a very strong correlation between genitalia and interest. So there's a reason gender identity is based on biological sex arose, because there are similarities across body type and to a lesser extent, but still statistically significant extent, mental characteristics. I'm not saying it even needs to be enforced. You just have to acknowledge that it's real. But this is something that gender warriors explicitly say is merely a social construct, that there's no category of traits that you can draw around the biological sexes and label those. That the label can mean anything. Anyone who wants others to use that label for them wants it to mean. No, just like binary cisgenders, you do have to acknowledge that gay kids and trans kids and tomboys and femboys, etc., are real, and that's fine. But to some extent, kids need to be able to discover this on their own, because we're far more likely to damage far more people by deconstructing the identity framework that most people naturally fall into, because they're going to be naturally falling into that. And if we try and program them out of that, that's going to cause a dysphoria and problems that would have never been there naturally. There is naturally occurring dysphoria, but we don't want to cause more we don't want to cause it in a majority of the population just to kind of soothe those who naturally have it. Because, again, we haven't actually addressed the dysphoria in that case anyway. So the idea that we're falsely programming children by defaulting to the norms, the probability, is false. It's coded in our biology, and the idea that recognizing this is oppressive is insane. We can still raise children with normal genders and be open to different expressions and transitions without confusing them. But what's actually oppressive is if we try to erase the natural tendencies in children and try to raise them assuming they're different. Because most kids will be cis and will be stereotypically expressive. Yes, I agree there's some problems with society programming kids to adopt social constructs, like that if you're a boy and you wear pink or dresses or makeup, you're gay or less manly. That's wrong. There's room for sissy boys and manly men. You know, I told you I was going to be using un-PC language today, but you know what I mean. So they're both men. But here's the thing. The gender warriors want you to think that if you're a boy who likes looking pretty and wearing makeup, you're probably a different gender. You're not a boy, which is an absolute enforcement of rigid gender stereotypes. I want boys and girls to feel comfortable expressing the femininity or the masculinity without feeling the need to question what gender they are. This will reduce trans regret too. You can express some femininity as a boy and masculinity as a girl and still be cisgender. It's healthy to say, hey, I want to be almost exclusively feminine, even though I was born a boy. It's okay for society to treat you as a woman. It's okay for you to be a man and still have very feminine traits. It's healthy to say you can express femininity as a man without being a woman. Because going back, there is actually no function to going by a new gender, especially if we take the non-binary principles. Well, they're all over the place, so they contradicts each other. So, but some of the principles say, basically, if you express differently, then you're not that gender. Some of the principles say that some of the principles say that whatever you are, you get to define what you are, but so that means that everyone expresses differently. Well, that's already obvious. So why do you need to switch pronouns? Just have the pronoun you already have and express that pronoun however you want. So maybe one day when we no longer reproduce sexually and we have easy genetic and surgical transformational technology and designer surgery, designer genetics, and there are all kinds of weird humans running around, maybe we'll invent some new type of pronouns for various categories of humans. I still don't think that they would be genders. Who knows? At that point, it's going to be something totally new. Because the human race will have changed. But that time has not come. But the time has come for me to end this broadcast. This has been far too long. Maybe you like it. Maybe you don't. This has been my gender manifesto. My Fundie Sunday. I feel like I'm losing my voice. Goodbye. And thank you. God bless.